Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley, the place where stories linger long after the lights go out. Tonight, we prepared chilling tales paired with the soothing sound of rain to ignite your imagination and make your heart race. If you feel the cold creeping in, tap that like button. It helps keep the shadows alive. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from or share the scariest moment that sent shivers down your spine. Don't forget to subscribe. You wouldn't want to miss what lurks in the darkness ahead. The apartment without an owner. It started with a sound. A faint rustle, barely noticeable at first. I wasn't sure where it was coming from, but I knew it was there. I'd been living in the same apartment complex for months, and everything was usually quiet. Too quiet, maybe. I remember thinking how odd it was that the building seemed to hum with an almost eerie stillness, like it was holding its breath. But that night was different. As I lay in bed, the sound became clearer, a soft, almost imperceptible shuffle, as if someone was moving in the next apartment. But that was impossible. I knew for a fact that no one had lived there for years. The place had been vacant as long as I could remember. The landlord, an old man who barely spoke to anyone, had told us there was no one interested in it, not for the past decade. I shifted uncomfortably under the covers, the sound growing louder now, like footsteps dragging across a dusty floor. It wasn't the usual creak of the building settling, it was something else, something unnatural. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the wind, or maybe a rat scurrying through the walls. But then, the doorbell rang. I froze. It was almost midnight. I didn't move, unsure if I had imagined it. I heard the bell again, this time more insistent. I had no idea who could be at my door. I wasn't expecting anyone, and besides, the hallway was empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I got up slowly, heart pounding in my chest. The hallway light flickered above me as I approached the door, my breath catching in my throat. I didn't want to open it. I wasn't sure why. There was nothing about this place or the people in it that had ever bothered me before, but tonight felt different. The doorbell rang once more, louder this time, as if the person on the other side knew I was listening. I reached for the handle, my hand shaking. And then, nothing. The bell stopped. I waited. Silence. Not even a sound from the apartment next door. Maybe it was nothing. Just some prank or a trick of the mind. But as I stood there, my hand on the doorknob, I couldn't shake the thought that something, or someone, was waiting for me. I turned away, deciding to ignore it. But as I did, the faint sound of movement started again, this time unmistakably closer. It was coming from the apartment next door. I glanced toward the walls, feeling a sudden, creeping chill. The apartment next door had been abandoned for years, but tonight it felt alive. The sound didn't stop. It wasn't just the scraping of furniture or the soft shuffle of steps anymore, it was more deliberate now, louder. Like something was dragging itself across the floor. My pulse quickened. I looked back at the door, half expecting it to be open, as if someone had slipped in unnoticed. But nothing. The hallway remained empty. I felt a rising sense of unease. I had to check. I hesitated. Part of me told me it was a bad idea, but the other part couldn't stop the urge to investigate. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, the dim light of the screen casting strange shadows across the room. I didn't want to call anyone. I didn't want to seem paranoid. But there it was again. A thump. Not just a thump, a loud, reverberating sound, almost like a door slamming open. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I crept out of my apartment, my footsteps quiet against the old, creaky floorboards. The hallway was dim, lit only by the faint glow of the emergency lights. My neighbor's door was at the end of the hall. The sound was clearer now, coming from there. I felt my breath catch in my throat as I approached it. The door was ajar. I stood there for a moment, staring at the crack in the door. It hadn't been opened before. I had checked. The apartment was always locked, always empty. But now, it was slightly ajar, as if someone had been inside. My mind raced. Was someone living there now? How could they have gotten in without anyone noticing? The sound stopped. Suddenly, the silence felt more suffocating than the noise had. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, just the old building settling. But I couldn't ignore the unease crawling under my skin. I pushed the door open slowly, the creak of the hinges sharp in the quiet. Inside, the apartment was just as I remembered it, dark, abandoned, and coated in a thick layer of dust. The furniture, once covered in sheets, was now bare, exposed to the air for who knows how long. The living room looked untouched by time, as if the people who had lived here had just vanished. But there was something off. The room felt heavy, charged with a presence I couldn't quite place. I stepped further inside, the floorboards groaning under my weight. The windows were covered in grime, and the stale air smelled of mold and decay. Yet, as I took another step, I heard it again. A whisper. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a voice I could recognize. It was just a whisper, low and unintelligible, like a voice from somewhere far away, or perhaps from within the walls themselves. My skin prickled. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind me with a loud bang. My heart lurched. I didn't move. I didn't dare. The apartment felt smaller now. The shadows seemed to stretch, as though the walls were closing in on me. I heard the sound of something scraping the floor again, closer this time. There was no doubt about it, someone, or something, was here with me. I backed away, my breath shallow, trying to stay calm. But panic was creeping in, tugging at my chest, pulling at my mind. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a welcome distraction, but I didn't reach for it. Not yet. The scraping stopped, and for a brief moment, there was only silence. But I could hear the faintest sound of breathing, slow and steady, like someone was standing just behind me. I turned around, and there, in the corner of the room, I saw it. A shadow. A shape that shouldn't have been there. It wasn't a person. It wasn't anything I could identify. But it was standing still, watching me, waiting. And then, the whisper came again, louder this time. Leave. I didn't need to hear it twice. I bolted for the door, hands trembling as I fumbled for the handle. It wouldn't budge. Panic surged through me. I pounded on the door, screaming, but the room seemed to swallow my voice, leaving only the chilling silence behind. The shape moved, and it was getting closer. I couldn't breathe. The air around me thickened, each inhale feeling heavier than the last. My heart raced as I turned back to the door, trying desperately to open it, but it remained stubbornly shut. The shape in the corner didn't move, not at first, but I could feel its presence, as if it was stretching toward me, pulling the air away with it. My mind screamed to run, to escape, but my legs refused to cooperate. I stood frozen, my eyes fixed on the dark corner, the shadow in it seeming to grow, bend, and flicker, like a candle's flame fighting against the wind. I forced myself to take a step back, only to feel the floor give way beneath me with a loud creak, as though the building itself had noticed my intrusion. The whisper came again, this time clearer, though still faint, "Leave, before it sees you." I didn't know what it was. I didn't want to know. My hands shook as I tried the door once more. This time, I could feel the air shift, something behind me had moved. The shape was no longer in the corner. My eyes darted around the room, but there was no sign of it. The silence was crushing, and for a moment, I thought I had imagined the whole thing. Then I heard it, the scraping sound again. This time it was coming from behind me, louder, more pronounced. As if whatever was moving was dragging itself slowly across the floor, inch by inch, getting closer with every heartbeat. I spun around, eyes wide, searching for whatever might be making that sound. But there was nothing. Except, the air was colder now. Much colder. I could see my breath, a faint mist in front of me. The room had changed. It wasn't just the silence that had deepened, but the very atmosphere itself felt different, like the walls were pressing in from all sides. The furniture, the empty space, the dust, it was all the same, but something had shifted, something was wrong. And then, I saw it. A movement in the shadows, a figure, tall, thin, and almost indistinguishable from the darkness itself, but undeniably there. Its outline was jagged, not human, not even fully shaped. It seemed to float, dragging its limbs slowly across the floor, one dragging step at a time, like something that had forgotten how to walk. I stepped back, my heart pounding in my ears. The figure paused, then tilted its head. I felt the stare, though its eyes weren't visible. It was as though the shadow could see inside me, could read the terror in my very soul. My throat tightened, and for a moment, I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I wanted to scream, but the sound stuck in my throat, thick and suffocating. The shadow didn't speak. It didn't need to. I could feel its presence, feel its intentions in the oppressive silence. It wasn't there to ask questions. It wasn't there to offer any comfort. It was there to take something. The whisper came again, but it wasn't distant this time. It was inside my head. You shouldn't have come. It's too late now. The cold deepened. I could feel it creeping into my skin, settling in my bones. I tried to move again, tried to run, but my body betrayed me. I was rooted in place, paralyzed by fear, by the overwhelming presence of whatever was in the apartment with me. And then it reached out. I could hear the faintest sound, like dry paper crumpling, then a sharp, wet scrape. I couldn't see its hand or its fingers, but I felt the air shift as it closed the distance between us. The light flickered, casting long, grotesque shadows across the walls. It was so close now that I could hear it breathing. Slow, deliberate, deep breaths, each one cold and heavy, like the breath of something ancient. I don't know how long I stood there. Time didn't feel real anymore. I was too terrified to move, too terrified to think. I could feel its presence at the back of my neck, as if it was waiting for me to turn around, waiting for me to acknowledge it. And then it spoke. Now, you belong to it. The whisper was more forceful this time, a final command that shook the very air. The room seemed to collapse in on me. The walls pressed closer, the floor buckling beneath my feet, the ceiling lowering with an unnatural slowness. I couldn't breathe. The figure stepped forward. I saw it, for the first time, clearly. Its face was an empty void, no features, no eyes, just blackness, a hollow space that seemed to devour all light around it. Its limbs twisted unnaturally, joints bending in ways that were impossible for any living being. The moment it reached for me, I felt my body seize. The coldness in the air surged, enveloping me entirely. My last breath froze in my throat, and the last thing I saw before everything went dark was the shape looming over me and the deep, endless darkness within it. When I awoke, I was no longer in the apartment. The world around me was dark, so dark, in fact, that I couldn't even see my own hands in front of my face. There was no floor beneath me, no walls around me. I wasn't sure where I was, or how I had gotten there. My head felt heavy, as if it were filled with cotton, and a dull ringing echoed in my ears. For a moment, I wondered if I was still trapped in some half-dream, some nightmare from which I couldn't wake. But then, I felt the air. It wasn't cold, not in the way it had been in the apartment. It was thick, like I was breathing through something dense, almost liquid. The air pressed down on me, as though I was submerged in a place that wasn't meant for living. A place that didn't follow the rules of reality. I struggled to sit up, but my body felt sluggish, as though I were weighted down by something invisible. My chest tightened. I needed to move. I needed to get out of whatever this was, but I didn't know where to go, or if there even was anywhere to go. And then, I heard it. A sound, low and guttural, like something dragging itself across the ground. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest. The sound was familiar. It was the scraping, the dragging steps I had heard before. The noise I had once thought was coming from the next apartment, the one that was abandoned. But this was different. This sound didn't belong to the apartment anymore. It belonged to something else, something darker, something more sinister. I tried to scream, but my voice didn't come out. There was only the dull ringing in my ears and the oppressive weight of the air around me. I tried to move again, to stand, to run, but it was like I was caught in some invisible web, each movement slow, clumsy, and futile. The sound came closer. I could feel it vibrating through the air, like the earth itself was shaking with each dragging step. And then, in the pitch-black void around me, I saw it. A figure, much like the one I had seen in the apartment, the shape, the shadow. But this time, it was clearer, more defined. Its form flickered and shifted like smoke, but there was no mistaking what it was. It was the same, only now it was bigger. Its limbs stretched unnaturally, and its silhouette seemed to loom over me, blocking out everything else. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was trapped. My mind screamed in terror, but my body refused to respond. The figure moved closer. I could feel its presence, like a weight on my chest, pressing down, suffocating me. It was reaching for me, its long fingers curling slowly in the air, like it was savoring the moment before it finally claimed me. The coldness of its touch was more than physical. It pierced into my very soul, freezing me from the inside out. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could feel was the overwhelming sensation of dread, of inevitability. It was here to take me. But then, something unexpected happened. The sound stopped. The figure froze in place, its hand outstretched but unmoving. The darkness around me seemed to shift, to ripple, as if the entire space were alive, reacting to the presence of something unseen. And then I heard it. A voice. It wasn't the whisper from before. It was deeper, more resonant, like it came from the very fabric of the place I was trapped in. You shouldn't have entered. I tried to speak, to ask who it was, what it wanted, but my voice failed me again. Instead, I heard a strange, almost muffled laughter echo in the blackness, not from the figure, but from somewhere beyond it, somewhere far off in the distance. It was cold, mocking, and yet filled with a kind of sorrow I couldn't understand. The laughter stopped, and the voice returned, but this time it sounded different, softer, almost like a warning. It is not yet your time. But you have seen too much. You know too much. I felt a sudden jolt, as if my body were being pulled in two directions at once. My heart skipped a beat as I gasped for air, but I wasn't sure I was breathing. The world around me seemed to twist, to fracture, and then everything went dark. I woke up in my apartment. It was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that presses against your eardrums, making you question if you're still awake or if the world around you has ceased to exist. The faint hum of the refrigerator, the distant buzz of the streetlights outside, the usual comforting noises, all gone. I wasn't sure if I had imagined everything, the darkness, the figure, the whispers. But when I tried to move, a sharp pain shot through my chest, as if something was still there, something that had followed me back from wherever I had been. I sat up in bed, my eyes darting around the room. The apartment looked the same, no signs of anything unusual. It was as if nothing had happened at all. But deep inside, I felt it. The dread that hadn't left me. I reached for my phone, trying to steady my shaking hands. The screen lit up with a new message. But it wasn't from anyone I knew. The message was simple. It's waiting for you. Don't go. I froze. I didn't recognize the number. I checked the time. It was still late at night. The message felt like a warning. But from who? From what? I stared at the screen, my mind racing. I knew I shouldn't go, that it would be foolish, that whatever it was, it wasn't finished with me yet. But the curiosity, the nagging pull to understand, to know, it overwhelmed me. Without thinking, I grabbed my jacket and hurried to the door. I wasn't sure where I was going, but I knew I had to go. I had to see it for myself. I couldn't live in fear of it anymore. I couldn't let it control me. I stepped out into the hallway. The building was eerily still, even quieter than usual. The faint scraping sound was gone, but the air still felt wrong, thick, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I made my way down the hall, the light flickering above me, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and twist in unnatural ways. When I reached the door to the abandoned apartment, my hand hovered over the doorknob. It was as if the apartment was calling me, urging me to open it. I took a deep breath and turned the handle. The door creaked open. The room inside was just as I remembered it, dim, covered in dust, untouched by time. But now, there was a subtle difference. The air was cold, colder than before. And the shadows seemed deeper, darker, like they were reaching out to pull me in. The moment I stepped inside, I felt it, the oppressive weight of the space. It was as if the apartment itself had been waiting for me. A whisper. Soft at first, but growing louder. You came back. I turned. The shadow was there, standing in the same corner where I had seen it before. But this time, it was clearer. It was more real. And it was staring directly at me. I backed away, my heart racing. No, I whispered to myself. I can't be here. I shouldn't be here. But my body didn't respond. I couldn't leave. My feet were rooted to the floor as if the apartment had claimed me once again, holding me in place with invisible chains. The figure moved, its long, twisted limbs stretching as it took a slow step forward, and then another, each movement deliberate, filled with purpose. The shadows around it flickered, bending with its every motion. You shouldn't have come back, it repeated, its voice more forceful this time, deep and suffocating. I tried to scream, to run, but it was too late. The room closed in around me, and the shadows seemed to consume the very air, pressing in from all sides. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. I was trapped. Then, the whisper again, this time louder than ever, shaking the very foundation of the apartment. Now, you belong to it. I felt a presence behind me, a coldness that wasn't just physical. It was inside me, wrapping itself around my soul. I couldn't fight it. I couldn't escape. The air grew colder still, and the world began to fade into darkness. And in the final moments, before everything went completely black, I understood. The apartment had never been abandoned. It had never been empty. It had always had an owner. It had always been waiting. For me. And now, I was part of it. The black umbrella. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon when I first noticed it. I was sitting in my usual spot by the window at the cafe, watching the downpour outside, sipping my lukewarm coffee, and trying to ignore the overwhelming sense of monotony that had been creeping into my life. The cafe was relatively empty, save for a couple seated in the far corner, their hushed voices blending with the soft jazz playing in the background. The smell of freshly baked pastries filled the air, and the low murmur of a nearby conversation seemed to soothe the restless mind. But something was different today. Something I couldn't place at first, yet it felt strange. A shift, subtle but undeniable. That's when I saw it, an old black umbrella, abandoned on the chair across from me. The handle was made of wood, worn smooth with time, and the fabric, though damp from the rain, had a deep, almost unnatural shade of black. I looked around. No one had entered the cafe carrying an umbrella like that. It was as if it had appeared out of nowhere, placed there by someone who had vanished without a trace. Curiosity tugged at me. I had seen the umbrella on the chair for a few minutes now, yet no one had taken it. It was almost as if it were waiting for someone to claim it. A sense of unease crept over me, but I tried to ignore it. I turned my attention back to the rain outside, the sound of it tapping against the window like a gentle reminder that the world beyond was still turning, still moving. I let my thoughts wander, but that umbrella, it wouldn't leave my mind. After a while, I stood up. Something inside me urged me to do it. I walked over to the chair, reaching for the umbrella. As soon as my fingers brushed the handle, I felt it, a coldness, deeper than the chill of the rain outside. It was a fleeting sensation, but it made me hesitate for just a second. I shook it off, telling myself I was being foolish. I picked up the umbrella, feeling the weight of it in my hand, and tucked it under my arm. I made my way to the counter to pay for my coffee, but as I handed the barista my money, a strange thing happened. The bell above the door jingled, signaling someone's entrance, and the cafe suddenly seemed different. The air was thicker now, and the temperature had dropped several degrees. I looked around, but the cafe remained the same. I felt an odd pressure building in my chest, like something was pressing down on me, but I couldn't figure out why. I left the cafe, the umbrella in hand, and stepped back into the rain. The wind had picked up, and the drops felt colder now, stinging my skin like needles. I walked toward my apartment, unaware of the dark turn my day was about to take. The next morning, I woke to a series of missed calls and a strange text message. My phone buzzed again as I groggily picked it up. It was from my friend James, who I hadn't heard from in weeks. Meet me at the cafe. We need to talk. Confused and slightly alarmed, I texted him back, asking what was wrong. He didn't respond immediately, but I could hear the tension in his voice when he answered the phone. "Where's the umbrella?" he asked, his voice shaking slightly. "What umbrella?" I replied, my brow furrowing. "The black one? The one from yesterday?" "Listen to me," he said quickly, almost desperately. "That umbrella, it's cursed. You have no idea what you've just done." I felt a chill run down my spine. James was usually the practical one, the skeptic. So why was he so shaken? He told me that a month ago, he'd been at the same cafe when a similar umbrella had been left behind by someone who disappeared just days later. That night, everything had gone wrong for James. His car broke down, his job had fallen through, and his apartment had been burglarized. In the span of just a few hours, his life had gone from normal to complete chaos. He had heard of similar stories, people who had taken the umbrella and experienced a series of unfortunate, even terrifying events. Some had lost their jobs, others their homes. A few had vanished altogether. "It's not just an umbrella," James whispered, almost too quietly for me to hear. "It's something else. It's a signal, a mark. Whoever touches it, it's like they're chosen. They're bound to it." I didn't want to believe him, but something inside me already knew that something was wrong. That strange feeling I had when I first picked up the umbrella, that creeping sense of dread, it was starting to make sense. But I still couldn't let it go. I had already taken it, and the thought of simply returning it seemed impossible. "James, I don't know what to do," I said, my voice cracking. He was silent for a moment before responding, "Get rid of it. As soon as possible. If you don't, it'll get worse." But it was too late. The moment I touched the umbrella, I had sealed my fate. The umbrella had already chosen me. I hung up the phone, my hands trembling. A heavy silence settled over me. My mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, trying to piece together the reality of what James had said. Was it true? Could such a thing even be possible? But deep down, I knew that the strange events in my life had already begun to line up with the curse James described. That night, I returned to my apartment with the black umbrella still clutched tightly in my hand. The streetlights outside flickered as I walked, casting elongated shadows on the wet pavement. The air felt thicker than usual, almost suffocating. Every sound was amplified: the rush of the wind, the distant hum of traffic, the occasional drip of rainwater from the gutters. Yet, it was strangely empty, as if the world around me had held its breath. When I stepped inside my apartment, the chill in the air seemed to intensify. It was as though the very walls were closing in. I dropped the umbrella by the door and collapsed onto the couch, my thoughts a mess. My mind kept drifting to James's warning, but I couldn't bring myself to act. I just couldn't. I had to understand what was happening to me, what the umbrella had done to my life. As I sat there, staring at the umbrella, the shadows in the room seemed to grow deeper, darker. The small lamp in the corner flickered, casting unsettling, erratic patterns across the walls. I could hear a faint, distant sound, like whispering voices coming from the direction of the umbrella. I stood up quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. I turned toward the umbrella, now lying innocently on the floor, but the strange sensation in the air had not subsided. The whispers grew louder, and then I heard it. A soft, deliberate knock at my door. I froze. No one ever came by unannounced, especially this late. I was paralyzed with fear, but I knew I had to check. I walked slowly to the door, the floor creaking beneath my feet, the sound unnervingly loud in the oppressive silence. I reached for the doorknob, but before I could twist it, the door swung open by itself. My breath caught in my throat. Standing in the doorway was nothing but darkness. It was as if the space beyond had swallowed the light, leaving nothing behind. And then, through the shadows, I saw something. A figure. Tall, its face obscured by the dark. But I could feel it watching me, its presence suffocating. My body froze, but I couldn't move away. I couldn't look away. Suddenly, I heard the voices again, louder now, more urgent. The sound came from the umbrella, which had somehow moved, now lying closer to the door than it had been moments before. I could hear the soft rustling of fabric, as if it were alive. I couldn't explain it, but I knew the umbrella was the source. It was calling to the darkness, and the darkness was answering. Without thinking, I stepped backward, slamming the door shut, heart hammering in my chest. I leaned against it, gasping for air. The whispers didn't stop. They had followed me into the apartment, filling the space with an unearthly hum, a buzzing sound in my ears that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The shadows had come alive, swirling in the corners of my vision. They were everywhere, creeping, pressing in on me. I could feel their weight, their coldness. It was as though they had always been here, waiting for me to let them in. I backed up into the living room, my mind racing for a way out. But there was no escape. The windows were shut tight, the apartment was locked. I was trapped. The figure at the door, it hadn't gone. I could still feel it, standing just beyond the door, waiting for me to make the next move. And the umbrella, it had a presence now, far more powerful than anything I could have imagined. I had to get rid of it, but the thought of touching it again filled me with dread. I turned to look at the black umbrella, lying in the center of the room, as though it had been placed there deliberately. It beckoned me. It was calling me back. And I couldn't resist. I took a step toward it. Before I could reach it, the door suddenly flew open with a violent force, slamming against the wall behind it. A gust of cold air rushed into the room, carrying with it the smell of damp earth and decay. I felt an intense pressure in my chest, as if the air was being sucked out of the room. The figure was standing in the doorway now, much closer, its form becoming clearer. It was human in shape, but its features were distorted, elongated, like it was made of shadow itself. Its eyes. I could see them now. Hollow, black pits that seemed to pull the light from around them. "Why did you take it?" the figure whispered. Its voice was not a voice, it was the sound of rustling leaves, the wind through the trees, something ancient and unknowable. I wanted to scream, but the words caught in my throat. The fear was overwhelming. The umbrella was no longer a mere object, it was a vessel. A conduit to something else. Something darker. Something that had claimed the lives of those before me, and now it had claimed mine. The figure reached out, its hand outstretched, as if it wanted to take something from me. But as it did, the lights in the apartment flickered, and the ground beneath me shook. I stumbled, trying to move away, but it was too late. The room closed in around me, and the shadows wrapped themselves tightly around my body, my mind. The umbrella had done its work. And then, everything went black. I never left the apartment. No one ever found me. When I regained consciousness, the world felt different, strange, and distorted. It was as if I had slipped into another reality, one that had bent and twisted under the weight of something dark. The room around me was unchanged, but the atmosphere had shifted. The air felt thick, heavier than before. It pressed against my skin, suffocating. I tried to move, but my limbs were stiff, as though they no longer obeyed me. I could hear my breath, shallow and uneven, but it sounded muffled, as if it were coming from far away. My mind was clouded, fragmented. Was this a dream? Had I really seen the figure at the door? The shadows, the whispers. Was I still alive? I struggled to sit up, forcing my arms to move despite the resistance. My head spun, but I managed to pull myself to my feet. I looked around the room, and everything appeared normal at first glance, the same worn furniture, the familiar layout of the apartment. The rain was still tapping softly against the windows, but it didn't bring me any comfort. The hum in the air was gone, replaced by an oppressive silence. And then, I saw it. The black umbrella lying in the middle of the room. It shouldn't have been there. The last time I saw it, it was by the door. But now, it was positioned perfectly in the center of the room, as if it had been placed there deliberately. It was as if it was waiting for me to acknowledge it, to touch it once more. I froze. The memories from the night before rushed back, filling my mind with a surge of panic. The figure, the cold, the darkness that had consumed the room. I hadn't imagined it. It was real. The umbrella was real. And it had taken something from me. My feet moved of their own accord, pulling me closer to it. I tried to fight the urge, but it was futile. There was a force at work, one that I couldn't comprehend, but couldn't resist. My hand reached out, trembling, as I touched the handle once again. The moment my fingers made contact, the temperature in the room dropped. The air became thick, almost solid. A low, guttural growl vibrated from the very walls of the apartment, sending shivers down my spine. My heart hammered in my chest, but I couldn't pull my hand away. The umbrella had me in its grip, and it wasn't letting go. A sharp, intense pain shot through my palm, as though the handle itself were alive, its surface biting into my skin. I gasped, trying to yank my hand back, but it wouldn't move. The pain intensified, and I cried out, feeling a pulse of energy surge through my body. It was as if the umbrella was drawing something from me, my strength, my will, my very essence. In the distance, I heard a voice, soft at first, almost a whisper. But as it grew louder, I realized it was not a voice at all. It was a collective sound, many voices overlapping, all calling my name. Why did you take it? The words felt like ice in my veins. The figure from last night, was it speaking to me again? No. The voices were coming from everywhere, not just from the doorway. They were inside my head, filling the space around me, echoing through the very walls. I could hear the whispers of those who had touched the umbrella before me, their pain, their torment, their pleas for release. The pain in my hand grew unbearable, and with a final, desperate effort, I ripped my hand away from the umbrella. But it didn't stop. The shadows in the room moved, swirling around me, tightening, as though they were reaching for me. I stumbled backward, colliding with the wall, my breath ragged. The shadows stretched toward me, pulling at my limbs, trying to drag me into them. I could feel their coldness creeping up my legs, their tendrils brushing against my skin. I wanted to scream, but the air in my lungs was gone. I was suffocating, drowning in the darkness that seemed to have no end. The umbrella lay there, unmoving, but I knew its presence was still with me. It was watching me, waiting for me to make a move. It was the source, the catalyst for everything. It had brought the figure, the shadows, the whispers. And now it was coming for me, to finish what it had started. I could feel it closing in on me, the air thickening, the darkness becoming all-encompassing. I had to get rid of it. I had to end it before it was too late. But how? What was the right way to destroy something so ancient, so powerful? I turned, stumbling toward the door. The umbrella was still there, its black surface gleaming under the dim light. I couldn't let it win. I couldn't let it consume me. I ran toward the exit, but the door wouldn't open. The handle refused to budge, as if the very building had been sealed shut by the umbrella's curse. I pulled harder, panic rising in my chest, but it was useless. The shadows were closing in. The figure was right behind me, its presence suffocating. I could hear its breathing, slow and deliberate, like the final countdown to my demise. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to stop it. And then, in that moment of utter despair, the whispers stopped. Everything went still. The figure was gone. The shadows were no longer pulling at me. The room was silent, except for the sound of my ragged breaths. I looked around, confused, disoriented. It was over. Or was it? I turned back toward the umbrella. It sat there, as it had before, its inky black surface gleaming in the half-light. But there was something different about it now. It wasn't just an umbrella anymore. It was a symbol of darkness, of death, of the curse that had already claimed me. And I knew, in that moment, that there was no escaping it. Not now. Not ever. I had become part of its story. I had become part of its curse. The stillness in the room was unbearable. My heart thudded in my chest, each beat louder than the last. I stood frozen, eyes locked on the umbrella, my mind a whirlpool of confusion and fear. Had I really escaped? Was it all over, or had I simply been granted a temporary reprieve? The silence was too quiet, too unnatural. It felt as though I was waiting for something, waiting for the next step, the next part of the nightmare to unfold. I knew better than to assume it was done. The umbrella, no, the curse, had been with me too long, had already marked me. It had seen me falter, seen me succumb to its pull. It wasn't over. It couldn't be. But what could I do? How could I fight something like this? I had no answers. No strength. I felt small in the face of something so ancient, so unstoppable. I turned away from the umbrella, moving as if in a trance. My feet dragged behind me, heavy with the weight of what I had just experienced. It was a mistake to ignore the warning signs before, but now I could feel the full brunt of the curse's power pressing down on me. I was marked. There was no escaping it now. The voices, the shadowed figure, the relentless whispers, they were a part of me. They would haunt me forever. I tried to think rationally, to convince myself that there had to be a logical explanation for all of this. The umbrella couldn't be the source of all my misfortune. It was just a coincidence, I told myself. There had to be a way out, a way to reverse whatever had been set in motion. Maybe I could destroy it, burn it, bury it far away where no one would find it again. Maybe, just maybe, I could erase the curse. But deep down, I knew that wasn't possible. The umbrella had already claimed too much of me. It had seeped into my bones, into my very soul. I needed help. The thought hit me like a lightning bolt. There was someone who might know what to do. Someone who had dealt with things like this before. James. He knew the history of the umbrella. He had warned me, but I had rejected his advice. I had dismissed the idea of supernatural forces, thinking they were nothing more than superstition. Now, I didn't have a choice. I had to reach out to him. I had to find a way to stop the curse before it consumed me entirely. Without thinking, I grabbed my phone, my fingers shaking as I dialed James's number. I could feel the weight of the umbrella's presence in the room as I waited for him to answer. Every second felt like an eternity. Finally, his voice came through, rough and tired. "Hello?" "James," I said, my voice trembling. "It's me. It's happening. The umbrella, it's real. Everything you said, it's happening to me. The shadows, the whispers. I don't know what to do. Please help me." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and then James spoke, his voice flat and serious. "I told you, didn't I? I warned you to stay away from it." "I didn't believe you," I whispered, guilt flooding my chest. "I thought it was just a superstition, but it's not. It's real. What do I do, James? Please, tell me." "You can't stop it," he said, his voice steady but cold. "Once you've touched the umbrella, once you've invited it in, there's no going back. You're bound to it now. It won't let you go." I felt my breath catch in my throat. "No, there has to be a way. There must be something we can do." He sighed, the sound almost inaudible. "There's only one way. You have to get rid of it. Completely. But it's not easy. It will fight you. It will do everything it can to keep you from destroying it. And once you try to burn it, to break it, you'll unleash something worse." "What do you mean? What's worse than this?" My voice was frantic now, my hands gripping the phone like a lifeline. "The curse doesn't just end with the umbrella," he said. "The umbrella is a key. It opens a door to something darker. Something that was always waiting behind it. If you destroy the umbrella, you might end up unleashing it. That thing that's been following you, the shadows, the figure, it's only a part of it." The room seemed to grow colder as he spoke. I could feel a tremor in my hands. The figure, the shadows, the curse. Everything I had experienced was suddenly so much worse. What had I done? What had I unleashed? "I have to do something," I whispered, feeling the fear choke me. "I can't just live like this. What do I do now?" James was silent for a moment before he spoke again, his voice heavy with warning. "You have to destroy the umbrella, but you can't do it alone. You need someone to help you, someone who understands what you're dealing with. I can't help you anymore. I've tried to warn you, but now you have to face it yourself. Just remember, whatever you do, don't let it touch you again. Don't let it bind you. Where can I find this person? Who do I trust?" I asked, my voice breaking. I can't do this on my own. There's a place. A person who might be able to help. I'll text you the address. But you need to leave now. Don't waste any more time." I didn't hesitate. The urgency in his voice, the warning in his tone, it was enough. I ended the call, quickly grabbed my coat, and ran out the door. As I walked through the streets, I felt the familiar weight of the umbrella in my mind, like a shadow trailing behind me. It was still there, a silent presence, waiting. But for the first time in days, I had a glimmer of hope. There was someone who might be able to help me. There had to be. And yet, As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled. The world around me seemed quieter, colder, as if the shadows themselves were gathering. Something was following me. Something worse than the umbrella. The deeper I got into the city, the darker it became. The curse had only just begun. I reached the address James had texted me, a small, unassuming building tucked away in a narrow alley. The neighborhood seemed strange, like a place out of time, its faded streets holding secrets beneath the shadows. My heart pounded as I approached the door, and I hesitated for just a moment, feeling the weight of the umbrella's curse on my back. The shadow, the figure, it was closing in. I knocked, my knuckles barely making a sound. A few seconds later, the door creaked open, revealing an old man with pale, tired eyes. His gaze swept over me, and I could feel the heaviness of his stare, as if he could see right through me. "You've come for answers," he said, his voice low, almost as if he were speaking in a language older than words. It wasn't a question, just a statement, but it hit me with a jolt. I nodded, too terrified to speak. He motioned for me to enter, and I did, stepping inside the dimly lit room. The air smelled musty, like old books and forgotten things. Shelves lined the walls, filled with strange trinkets, ancient tomes, and what looked like relics from another age. The space felt like a shrine to the supernatural, an altar to powers I couldn't begin to understand. "I know what you seek," the man said, his voice heavy with both pity and warning. "You've touched the umbrella, haven't you?" I nodded again, this time barely able to breathe. "What do I do? How do I stop it?" The man studied me for a long moment before answering. "The umbrella is a doorway, a portal to something far older and darker than anything you could comprehend. You were never meant to touch it. Now, you are bound to it, and its curse will follow you until your last breath unless you sever that bond." I felt a cold chill seep through me as I clutched at the collar of my coat, trying to stave off the growing dread. But James said, he said that if I destroyed the umbrella, I could unleash something worse. Something worse than this. "What do I do?" The man's eyes narrowed. James is right. Destroying the umbrella won't destroy the curse. It will only set loose what's been lying in wait behind it. That's what you have to understand. The umbrella isn't the real source. It's only the key. He paused, his words hanging in the air like a heavy fog. If you destroy the umbrella, you won't just release the shadows or the figure. You'll release the creature behind it all. The one that's been manipulating everything from the start. And that creature is a part of you now. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. "What do you mean? How could it be part of me?" The man didn't answer immediately. He turned to one of the shelves and pulled down a large, dusty book. The pages were yellowed and brittle, the edges frayed with age. He opened it carefully and showed me a drawing, an ancient symbol, a symbol I recognized. "That symbol," he said, pointing to it. "It's the mark of the creature, the one bound to the umbrella. But the creature doesn't just belong to the umbrella. It's part of a curse that was passed down generations ago. A curse that attaches itself to anyone who makes the mistake of taking the umbrella into their hands. The moment you touched it, the creature marked you." I recoiled, the blood draining from my face. "No, that's not possible. It can't be me. I didn't ask for this." The man sighed. "No one ever does. That's the nature of the curse. It doesn't care about your choices. It doesn't care about who you are. It simply feeds on fear, on the soul of whoever touches the umbrella. And in turn, it becomes part of them. My head spun. So, I'm already lost? The man shook his head, his expression somber. Not yet. But time is running out. The umbrella is the trigger. You've seen what it can do, the shadows, the figure, the whispers. But those are only the beginning. As the curse strengthens, the creature will grow stronger too. And when it's strong enough, it will take full control. It will become you. I could barely process what he was saying. My hands trembled, my mind spiraling. What do I do? Tell me what to do. He looked at me, his eyes unwavering. You have two choices. You can attempt to destroy the umbrella, but know this, once it's gone, the creature will become fully unleashed. It will hunt you, it will twist your mind until you're nothing but a shell, a vessel for its darkness. You'll be lost forever. I shook my head, unable to believe what I was hearing. And the second choice? The man's voice dropped to a whisper. The second choice is far worse. You can keep the umbrella, keep the curse. Live with it. But the creature will never let you rest. It will whisper to you, pull you into the shadows, feed off your fear and your soul until you've lost everything. You'll never be free. I felt the weight of his words settle on me like a 1,000-ton stone. I had already been marked. I had already chosen. But now, faced with these two grim choices, I didn't know what to do. Neither path offered escape. Both paths led to destruction. Either way, I lose, I whispered, my voice barely audible. The man nodded slowly. Yes. That's the price you pay for curiosity. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But there was no escaping what I had done, no escaping the umbrella's curse. The shadows were already gathering outside the door. I could feel them creeping closer, closing in on me. And the figure was there, watching, waiting. I turned away from the man, my feet carrying me toward the door. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know what to do. But I knew one thing, whatever choice I made, it was too late to turn back. And the creature behind the umbrella was already coming for me. I left the old man's house without another word, my mind in chaos. The weight of the decision was crushing, like a 1,000-pound burden pressing down on my chest. As I walked through the darkened streets, I couldn't shake the feeling that the creature, the thing that had attached itself to me, was out there, watching, waiting. It was no longer a distant threat. It was here. It was inside me. The streetlights flickered as I moved, casting long, eerie shadows on the pavement. The cold wind bit at my skin, but it was nothing compared to the icy chill crawling through my veins. I had no idea what to do. The umbrella, the key to all of this, was back at my apartment, tucked safely away, and yet it felt like it was still with me. I could almost hear the whispers, faint and distant, like a murmur in the back of my mind. The shadows shifted around me, teasing the edge of my vision. I was being followed. Or maybe it was just my mind, unraveling. I reached my apartment building, the door opening with a creak that echoed down the empty hallway. The place was still, eerily so, but as I walked down the hall toward my door, the unease in my chest only deepened. It was as if the air itself had grown heavier, more oppressive. I knew, without a doubt, that something was waiting for me inside. I hesitated before entering, my hand hovering over the doorknob. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as though urging me to open the door, to face whatever was inside. It was my choice now: destroy the umbrella and unleash the creature, or leave it alone and continue living with the curse. With a deep breath, I pushed the door open. The apartment was quiet. The umbrella was exactly where I had left it, resting innocently in the corner by the window. But the moment I stepped inside, I felt it, the pressure in the room, the weight of something watching me. The shadows shifted, twisting unnaturally, and the temperature dropped. It felt as if the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I moved toward the umbrella, my steps slow and heavy, like I was walking through thick mud. My heart raced as I reached out, my fingers trembling. I knew I had to make a choice. But the choice was too much. The fear, the uncertainty, the dread of what might come next, it was suffocating. The moment my hand brushed against the umbrella's handle, a shiver ran through me, and the room seemed to warp. The shadows deepened, swirling around me like a living thing, their edges flickering with malevolent energy. I could feel the presence of the creature, its breath on the back of my neck, the coldness of its touch in my bones. Suddenly, the whispers became clearer. They were no longer faint murmurs. They were words. "Destroy it," they urged. "End it now. You have no choice. It will consume you if you don't." I recoiled, the voice inside my head like a vice around my skull. It was as though the umbrella itself was speaking to me, its curse wrapping around me tighter. I could hear the figure, the thing that had followed me, moving in the shadows, but I couldn't see it. I could feel it getting closer, its presence pressing in from all sides. "No," I whispered to myself, fighting against the pull. "I can't destroy it. I can't unleash it." But the umbrella was there, its presence undeniable, pulling me closer. The whispers intensified, pushing against my mind. "Destroy it, and you will be free. Let it go, and you will remain trapped forever." I had to make a decision. I knew that either way, there was no going back. The creature had already begun to take hold of me. It was only a matter of time before it completely consumed me. I grabbed the umbrella, my fingers wrapping around the cold, smooth handle. The darkness in the room pressed in around me, and for a moment, I felt as though the entire apartment was closing in. The shadows seemed to have a life of their own, writhing and curling as they reached for me. I could hear them, feel them, like claws scraping across my skin. And then, the figure appeared. It was standing in the doorway. Its shape was indistinct, but its presence was overwhelming. It was the embodiment of darkness, of everything I had feared. The air seemed to crackle with its power, and I knew, deep down, that if I didn't act now, I would never get another chance. I had to act. With trembling hands, I raised the umbrella high above my head. My heart raced, my breath shallow, as I fought the urge to run. The creature was close now, its breath hot and foul on my skin. The shadows closed in, the whispers growing louder. It was now or never. I slammed the umbrella against the ground with all my strength. For a moment, nothing happened. The room was silent. The figure in the doorway was still. The shadows seemed to freeze. Then, everything exploded. The room seemed to shudder, the air thickening with an unbearable pressure. The shadows surged forward like a wave crashing against a cliff, wrapping around me, suffocating me. The figure stepped forward, its form solidifying, and I could finally see it. It was me. A twisted version of myself, a reflection of everything I had become. Its eyes were dark, empty voids, its face a mask of anguish and despair. I wanted to scream, but the words caught in my throat. It reached out, its fingers brushing against my skin, and in that moment, I understood. I had destroyed the umbrella. But in doing so, I had unleashed the creature myself. The curse had been inside me all along, and now it had taken full control. The last thing I remember is the sound of my own scream echoing in the darkness. Then, nothing. The umbrella is gone. But the curse remains. The guest from the basement. It started innocently enough, just the kind of thing you'd ignore on a quiet, uneventful evening. The house was old, creaky even, and the wind had a way of making strange noises that echoed through the walls. But this was different. It began about 2 weeks ago. Every night, at the same time, right after midnight, there would be a faint sound. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, or maybe a pipe expanding and contracting, but the sound became too distinct to ignore, a soft creak followed by a loud thud, as if something heavy was being dragged across the floor. And then, silence. I remember the first night I heard it, I told myself not to worry. But then it happened again, and then the same time the next night. It was coming from the basement. I tried to dismiss it. We had just moved into this old house. Of course, things were going to be a little off. But it felt different this time. The house, while lovely, had a certain oppressive feel to it. The basement, especially, seemed to draw me in, almost like it had a pull I couldn't quite explain. At first, it was just the sound of the door creaking open. But when I checked the basement door every morning, I saw it slightly ajar, as if someone had been inside. My family didn't use the basement, except for storage, and we were all upstairs when the noises occurred. But each day, the door would be open, ever so slightly. I remember telling my wife, Kate, about it, but she shrugged it off, saying I was imagining things. "You're tired," she said. "You're just hearing things in your sleep." But I knew I wasn't imagining it. I wasn't tired or stressed. I was certain I heard it. I began setting up cameras, just to prove it to myself. I didn't tell her about the cameras. I didn't want to worry her until I knew for sure. The next night, when the sound came again, I went straight to the living room and checked the footage. My stomach dropped as I saw the basement door. It opened by itself, with no wind, no reason for it to budge. Just opened. I rewound it, playing the scene again, and my breath caught in my throat when I saw it. The door creaked open just a few inches, and then the shadow moved. I froze, my hand hovering over the mouse. The shadow, something dark, something moving, appeared in the corner of the frame. It didn't look human. It was low to the ground, like it was crawling. And then it stopped. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay there in bed, eyes wide open, listening to the silence that followed the noises. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside made my heart race. Kate didn't hear it. Our kids didn't hear it. But I knew something was down there. Something was waiting. The next morning, I played the video again. The door was still open, just as I had left it. But I was afraid to go down there. It felt like whatever was in the basement was aware of me watching. It knew I was coming closer. That's when I began to hear it more clearly now. A soft, scratching sound, followed by a faint whisper. It was almost as if it was calling my name. I knew I had to go down there. But what if it was worse than I could imagine? What if it wasn't just the house settling, or my mind playing tricks? What if there was something down there, something waiting for me? And so, I made my decision. Tonight, I would find out what was causing the noises. The sun had long set, and the house was submerged in an eerie stillness, a deep silence that seemed to press against my chest. I had tried to prepare myself, tried to reason with the thoughts swirling in my mind. Maybe it was just an old house. Maybe the door was malfunctioning, the hinges were loose, and the shadows were simply tricks of the light. But my instincts told me otherwise. They told me I wasn't alone in this house anymore. I waited until Kate and the kids were asleep. I didn't want to involve them, not yet. I didn't want to scare them. But as I stood there in the dark, with only the faint glow of my phone to light the way, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was making a terrible mistake. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and made my way to the basement door. The old wooden steps creaked beneath my feet, each step seeming lighter than the last, as if the house itself was warning me, pleading with me to stop. The basement door, just as I had left it, was slightly ajar. I could already hear the faint hum of the air conditioning, the quiet shuffle of something unseen in the darkness below. My hand shook as I reached for the handle. The cold metal sent a jolt through me like an electric shock. I pulled the door open. A gust of cold air rushed up from the basement, carrying with it a strange scent. It wasn't unpleasant, but it was sharp, like damp earth and something else, something metallic. I shone my flashlight into the abyss of the stairwell. The light flickered, casting long, jagged shadows across the stone walls. I felt as though I was looking into the mouth of a cave, something ancient, something that had been waiting for me. I took a deep breath and descended the stairs, my heart hammering in my chest. Each step felt like it was taking me deeper into something I couldn't explain, something that made my skin crawl. The sounds from below grew louder, the scraping, the shifting. I could almost hear breathing, but it wasn't mine. As I reached the bottom, I swung the flashlight around the room. The basement was dim, cluttered with old boxes and forgotten furniture. Nothing seemed out of place, but the air was thick, almost oppressive, as though something was pressing down on me from all sides. I moved further into the basement, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of dust that covered the floor. The wooden beams above creaked under the weight of silence. Then I saw it. The corner of the room, where shadows pooled like ink, seemed darker than the rest of the basement. And there, standing just outside the reach of my flashlight beam, was someone. A figure, hunched low to the ground, its face hidden in the shadows. It wasn't human. Its limbs were too long, too twisted. I could see its hands, pale and thin, clutching the edge of an old, rusty pipe that jutted from the wall. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. Was it real? Was this some sort of hallucination, a product of stress and fear? And then, the figure moved. It wasn't fast. It was slow, deliberate, dragging its body across the floor as though it was savoring my terror. The scratching sound, the same one I had heard on the camera footage, echoed through the basement, sending a shiver down my spine. It was real. It was down here. And it was waiting for me. My flashlight flickered again, and in that split second, I saw it. Its eyes. Deep, black pits that seemed to absorb all light, all warmth, all hope. It was watching me. I wanted to run. I wanted to turn and flee, but my legs refused to move. My body was frozen, locked in place by an overwhelming sense of dread. Then, in a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, it spoke. "Come closer." The voice was soft, but it carried weight. It felt heavy, suffocating. I didn't know what it wanted, but I knew I couldn't stay here. I had to leave. I had to. Before I could even take a step, the figure lunged toward me, its long arms stretching out with a speed that defied its appearance. I stumbled backward, my heart racing in my chest, my mind screaming at me to get out, but my feet felt like they were stuck in molasses. I ran. I don't remember how, but I was upstairs in what felt like an instant, panting and shaking, slamming the basement door shut behind me. The door had been open, wide open, and now it was closed. I fell to the floor, my body trembling with fear. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't move. Was it still down there? Was it real? Or had I just imagined it all? I didn't sleep that night. And neither did Kate. I couldn't bring myself to tell her what happened. Not yet. She wouldn't believe me. She couldn't. Not until she saw it for herself. The next morning, I checked the cameras again, expecting to see the basement door open or some trace of the creature I had seen. But the footage was normal. Nothing had changed. Yet, I knew it was still down there. And it was waiting. The days dragged on. I tried to convince myself that what had happened was just a nightmare, that the stress of moving into a new house, the late nights, the endless unpacking had finally gotten to me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The events in the basement were real, and the presence was still there, lurking in the shadows of the house. Kate noticed my increasing unease. I had always been the calm one, the rational one. But now, I was jumping at every sound, avoiding the basement door, and walking around the house like it was a haunted maze. "Are you sure you're okay?" she asked one night, concern in her eyes as I stared at the basement door from across the room. "Yeah, I'm fine," I lied, forcing a smile. "Just tired." But I wasn't fine. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was in that basement was getting closer. It wasn't just a random occurrence anymore. It was intentional. The sounds had started again that night, the creaking of the basement door, the quiet scrape of something moving down there. I couldn't take it anymore. That night, after Kate and the kids were asleep, I stood by the stairs, flashlight in hand, staring down into the pitch-black abyss of the basement. The door was still shut, but I knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. I had to confront this, once and for all. I couldn't let fear control me. But as I took my first step toward the basement, the house seemed to groan in protest, as if it, too, was warning me to turn back. The wood beneath my feet felt like it was shifting, creaking in ways that were impossible. The walls seemed to be closing in. I reached the basement door, hand trembling as I gripped the knob. The house was silent, almost unnaturally so. It was as if everything had stopped moving, waiting for something to happen. I pushed open the door. The air was colder than it had been before, and that strange metallic scent was stronger. I hesitated, standing in the doorway, shining the flashlight into the darkness, scanning the corners of the room. But there was nothing there. No figure. No movement. Just silence. I took a tentative step down the stairs, my heart hammering in my chest. The flashlight beam flickered as if responding to the tension in the air, casting jittery shadows on the walls. The stairs creaked under my weight, and for a moment, I thought I heard the faintest whisper, so faint I could barely make it out. "Come closer." I froze. The voice. It was the same as before. That cold, guttural whisper. It felt like it was coming from the walls themselves, like it was crawling inside my mind. I turned the flashlight in the direction of the sound, but there was nothing. Nothing except the shadows, the emptiness that seemed to stretch forever in the dim light. I couldn't leave now. I had to know. I moved further into the basement, my legs feeling like they were made of lead. The flashlight revealed more of the space, old furniture covered in thick layers of dust, boxes that hadn't been touched in years. But the strangest thing was the corner of the room, the one I had seen before, where the shadows always seemed darkest. I approached it slowly, my every step echoing in the silence. As I got closer, I saw something new. A set of footprints, faint but undeniable, leading into the corner of the room. They were small, too small for an adult, but there was something off about them. They weren't like any footprints I had seen before. They seemed to drag. Like someone, or something, was crawling on all fours. I leaned down to inspect them, my breath coming in shallow gasps. And that's when I saw it. A pale hand, curled at the edge of the shadows. I stumbled backward, almost tripping over my own feet, my pulse racing. The flashlight beam shook violently, but I couldn't look away. The hand was slowly moving, twitching, like it was coming alive. It crawled out of the darkness, the long fingers scraping against the floor in an unsettling rhythm. And then I saw it. A face. No, not a face, not fully human. The skin was pale, stretched tight over its skull, eyes too wide and too dark, like pits that absorbed every bit of light. Its mouth was twisted into something between a grin and a snarl, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. It was the same thing I had seen before, the creature that had been waiting in the shadows. It was real. It was here. My heart pounded in my ears as I backed away, but the creature didn't move. It stayed there, watching me, its eyes never leaving mine. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I was frozen in place, caught in its gaze. Then, in a voice that was not its own, not human, it spoke. "Welcome home." The words were cold, like they had been carved into my soul. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. The creature crawled closer, dragging itself toward me with terrifying speed. And in that moment, I knew. I knew I wasn't alone in this house. I had never been alone. The creature lunged forward, its claws reaching for me, but everything went black. I woke up in the living room, gasping for air, heart racing. I was lying on the couch, Kate sitting next to me, her eyes wide with concern. The kids were in bed, unaware of what had happened. You passed out," Kate said, her voice trembling. "You weren't breathing." I thought. "I'm fine," I interrupted, sitting up. My head was spinning, and I could still feel the cold chill of the basement on my skin. But I knew it wasn't over. I knew whatever had been waiting in the basement was still there, watching me, waiting for the next time I'd step into its domain. And it wouldn't be long. I could feel it. It was only a matter of time before the guests returned. The days that followed were a blur of confusion and fear. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was constantly watching me, lurking just out of sight. The basement door remained shut, but I could feel it, deep in my bones. The presence was still there. And it was waiting for me to return. Kate had no idea what had happened down there. I told her that I must have fainted from exhaustion, that the stress of everything had finally caught up with me. But how could I explain what I had seen? The creature, the whispering voice, the way it seemed to reach out to me in the dark. I couldn't. Not without sounding insane. I tried to stay away from the basement, telling myself it was just a figment of my imagination, a trick of the mind. But I couldn't ignore the sensation that the house itself was changing. The air grew heavier, the rooms colder, as if the house was reacting to the presence down there, amplifying it. Every night, I would hear the creaking of the floorboards, the sound of movement coming from beneath, though I knew no one else was awake. I thought calling someone, maybe a professional, someone who could explain it. But what if it made things worse? What if this thing I had awakened, this presence, was something beyond explanation? Beyond help? The night it happened again, I had just settled into bed, trying to ignore the growing dread in my chest. Kate was asleep beside me, her breathing steady and calm. But I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house seemed louder now, more pronounced. It wasn't the house settling. It wasn't just the wind. I could hear footsteps from below, soft but distinct. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me. But then the unmistakable sound came again, the basement door creaking open. Slowly, steadily, as if something or someone was pushing it from the other side. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. Kate stirred beside me, but I didn't move. I couldn't move. The sound continued, the door opening just a little more with each passing second. It was like someone was inviting me down there. I tried to breathe deeply, to calm myself. But I couldn't. I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. Whatever was down there, whatever had been watching me, was coming closer. I quietly slid out of bed, my body tense, every muscle screaming at me to stop, to run. But I didn't. I had to know. I had to face it, whatever it was. The flashlight trembled in my hand as I descended the stairs, the beam flickering in the darkness. The air was thick with an unnatural chill, the kind that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand on end. The basement door was ajar now, just enough for me to see into the void beyond. I took a step toward it. Another step. And then I froze. There was movement in the dark. A figure, barely visible, standing at the bottom of the stairs. It wasn't human. It was hunched over, its limbs bent at unnatural angles, its shape twisted and wrong. The flashlight beam caught something shiny in the dark, eyes, wide and unblinking, staring straight at me. The air was suffocating. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The creature's form began to shift, expanding in the darkness, like it was filling the room with its presence. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. My feet were glued to the floor, my body frozen in place. I watched as the creature moved, its long fingers scraping the floor as it crawled toward me, dragging itself closer with terrifying speed. "Leave," it whispered, its voice a rasping growl that sent chills through my entire body. I couldn't speak. I couldn't even move. All I could do was watch as the creature came closer, its eyes never leaving mine, its grin widening as it saw my fear. And then, just as it was almost within reach, the light flickered. For a split second, the basement went dark. I heard a screeching noise, a sound like metal tearing, and the air seemed to shift around me. When the light returned, the creature was gone. The basement was empty again, as if nothing had ever happened. I stood there, panting, my heart racing in my chest. My mind screamed at me to leave, to run up the stairs and lock myself in the bedroom, to never come back. But something inside me, something dark and terrifying, compelled me to take one more step into the room. The footprints were there again. But they weren't the same. These were deeper, more pronounced, as if whatever had been down there was no longer crawling, but standing. And in the middle of the room, there was something new. A small, crumpled piece of paper stained with something dark. I bent down to pick it up, my hands trembling. The message was simple, written in jagged handwriting. I'm not alone anymore. My stomach churned. The air around me grew colder, the room darker. I felt it again, that presence, moving just out of sight. Something had changed. The creature wasn't alone anymore. I didn't know what it meant, but I knew one thing: this was just the beginning. The days blurred together after that night. I tried to tell myself that it was over, that whatever had haunted the basement had left. But the unease in the house continued to grow. The footsteps became louder, more frequent. The air never quite warmed up, no matter how high I turned the thermostat. The house felt like it was closing in on me, like it was shrinking around my body, tightening its grip on me with every passing hour. I could hear the whispers at night now, soft and indistinct, but always there, always just out of reach. The creaking of the stairs, the faint rustling from behind closed doors. The strange sensation that someone was watching me, waiting. But it wasn't just me. Kate was starting to hear things too. She would wake in the middle of the night, her eyes wide with terror, listening to the silence, trying to convince herself it was nothing. But we both knew. We both felt it. The house was alive, and it was angry. That's when I started looking through the footage from the security cameras again. The basement door, now wide open, no longer appeared to be simply moving on its own. There was something else in the footage, something I hadn't noticed before. In the frames, there was a figure. A shadow. Not moving, but watching. It stood perfectly still, like a statue, in the darkened corner of the basement. Its outline was blurry, indistinct, but the eyes were clear. Two piercing points of light, glowing faintly in the dark, staring directly at the camera. I had to show Kate. She needed to see this. She had to understand that it wasn't just my mind playing tricks on me, that the thing in the basement wasn't a figment of my imagination. But when I tried to tell her, she just looked at me blankly. The terror was there in her eyes, but she refused to believe it. She didn't want to accept it. I think it's just stress, she said, her voice shaking. We've been through so much. This isn't real. But deep down, I knew it was real. And whatever it wasn't just in the basement. It was everywhere now. The house had become its home, and it was growing stronger with every passing day. That night, I couldn't sleep. The house felt wrong, too quiet, too still. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening for any sign that something was moving in the dark. The whispering had stopped, but that only made it worse. The silence was suffocating. Suddenly, I heard a noise, soft, like the tap of a finger on wood. Then another, louder this time. It came from the hallway outside our room. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. I didn't move. I couldn't. The sound came again, closer now, as if something was walking down the hall toward our door. I could hear the slow, deliberate steps, each one heavier than the last. I knew it wasn't Kate. She was sound asleep beside me, her breathing slow and steady. I reached for the flashlight I kept under my pillow, my hands shaking so violently I almost dropped it. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but when I shone the light into the hallway, I froze. The door to the basement was open again. But this time, there was something different. The shadow from the camera footage was no longer just a blur. It was there, standing at the top of the stairs. The faint glow of its eyes visible in the darkness. It was waiting. I felt the air grow colder, the temperature plummeting in a heartbeat. My breath came out in visible puffs as I stood frozen in place. The creature, whatever it was, shifted, its form slowly rising from its crouched position. Its limbs stretched out in unnatural angles, cracking as it moved, like it hadn't used them in years. I wanted to scream, to wake Kate, to run. But the air around me seemed to press in, suffocating me, freezing me to the spot. It took one step toward me, then another. Each step was heavy, deliberate. The eyes never left mine. The creature spoke again. Its voice was different this time, deeper, almost growling. You shouldn't have come back. I didn't understand. I didn't know what it wanted, what it meant. But I knew one thing, I couldn't let it reach me. I bolted for the door. I could hear it following, the scraping of its claws against the floor, the thudding of its heavy footsteps getting closer with each second. I slammed the door behind me and locked it, panting, my heart racing in my chest. But I could still hear it. I could feel it outside the door, pressing against it, waiting for the moment to break through. I turned to Kate, but she was already awake now. Her eyes were wide with fear, her mouth open in a silent scream. But she wasn't looking at me. She was looking past me, at the shadow in the corner of the room. No. No, I whispered, backing away. The shadow moved again, slowly, taking form. It was standing in the room now, a solid, dark figure, its face hidden in shadow. But I could still feel its eyes on me. Cold. Empty. I grabbed Kate's hand. We have to get out, I said, my voice shaking. We can't stay here anymore. But as I reached for the door, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The basement door was open, and the stairs were empty. There was nothing there. But I knew, deep down, that it had never left. It was still here, in the house. And no matter how far we ran, it would always find us. And as we turned to leave, I heard it again. A soft whisper right behind me. You can't escape. Blue lightning. It was a quiet evening on the farm, the kind where everything seemed to slow down, and the air hung heavy with the scent of earth and grass. My family had been farming for generations, and after a long day of tending to the crops and animals, we were used to the calm that settled over the land at dusk. It was during these moments that I felt most at home, the familiar rustle of the wind through the trees and the distant lowing of cows in the fields. But that night, something was different. The storm had been brewing for hours. At first, it was nothing more than a typical darkening sky and the occasional rumble of thunder. I remember standing on the porch, watching the horizon, the storm clouds swirling like dark giants. My father was in the barn, checking on the animals, and my younger brother, Sam, was out in the fields, bringing in the last of the hay. Dad, I think this one's going to be a big one, I said, my voice carrying a hint of concern. We had seen many storms, but this one felt wrong. He looked up, squinting into the gathering darkness. Don't worry, son. It's just another thunderstorm. We'll be fine. But as the night deepened, the wind picked up, and the first flashes of lightning split the sky. It wasn't like any lightning I had ever seen before. It was a deep, unnatural shade of blue. The kind of blue you might see in the depths of the ocean, but far too bright and unnatural to belong in the sky. I stood frozen on the porch, staring at the sky, my breath caught in my throat. The lightning flashed again, and this time I could feel it. Something was wrong. The sky seemed to pulse with an eerie energy, and I could hear the faint sound of something moving in the distance, like the rush of wind through the trees, but sharper, more focused. I felt it in my chest, this strange vibration in the air, as if the storm wasn't just a natural occurrence, but something alive, something conscious. Suddenly, I heard the unmistakable sound of hooves pounding on the dirt path, coming from the direction of the barn. I spun around, my heart racing, expecting to see my father or Sam returning, but there was no one. The storm was getting stronger now, and the lowing of the cows grew louder, frantic, like they were in some kind of panic. The blue lightning flashed again, and that's when I saw it. A flash of movement in the distance, on the horizon, near the barn. The light from the storm illuminated a figure, but it was gone almost as quickly as it appeared. My mind raced. Was it a person? A shadow? No. It couldn't have been. I rushed to the barn, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't quite understand. Whatever had been out there, it wasn't natural. I couldn't explain it, but something was out there, and I needed to find out what. The barn was eerily silent when I arrived. The animals were all in their stalls, but the air felt thick with tension. It was as if they could sense something was wrong too. I called out for Dad and Sam, but there was no answer. My voice echoed back to me in the silence, an uncomfortable reminder that I was alone. I moved deeper into the barn, looking for any sign of them. That's when I saw it, something that made my blood run cold. The cows. There were only a few of them left in their stalls. The others, at least 5, were missing. I checked the stalls again, desperately, but there was no sign of them. No tracks, no signs of struggle, nothing. It was as if they had simply vanished. Then, the storm hit. The wind howled, and the rain poured down in sheets, the thunder so loud it shook the very ground beneath me. I ran outside, searching for my father, for Sam, for anyone who could explain what was happening. The blue lightning flashed again, lighting up the sky like a spotlight. I turned toward the field, where the cows had been grazing earlier, and I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. In the distance, beyond the fence line, I saw shapes, figures moving in the storm. At first, I thought it was my father and Sam, but as I squinted through the rain, I realized they were far too tall. They moved too fluidly, too strangely, as if they were not quite human. I called out, but my voice was lost in the wind. The figures moved closer, and I could hear them now, the rhythmic sound of hooves against the wet earth. But the hooves didn't sound like cows. They were heavier, deeper, almost mechanical. And they were coming for me. I turned and ran back toward the house, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew I had to get inside. I couldn't explain what was happening, but I knew it was not normal, and it was not safe. But as I reached the front door, I froze. Behind me, I heard the sound of hooves again, closer this time. And then, I saw it. A flash of blue lightning illuminated the sky, and in that brief moment, I saw them, figures in the storm, riding horses that were not horses at all. Their bodies were dark, twisted, and seemed to shift in the light, as if they were made of smoke or shadows. They weren't human. They were something else. And they were coming for us. I slammed the door shut behind me, heart pounding, barely aware of the rain hammering down on the roof above. I locked the door, though I knew it wouldn't stop whatever was out there. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. What were those creatures? Where had they come from? And where had the cows gone? I stumbled into the living room, my eyes darting toward the window, half expecting to see those shadowy figures staring back at me from the storm. But there was nothing. The yard was dark, the trees swaying under the heavy rain, the only sound the violent gusts of wind and the occasional distant crash of thunder. I could hear my breathing, too loud in the oppressive silence, and I felt a sense of dread creeping up my spine. My thoughts were a jumbled mess. I needed to find Dad. I needed to find Sam. They had to be out there somewhere. I grabbed the phone from the table, my hand shaking as I dialed my father's number. It rang once, twice, 3 times. I kept staring at the window, waiting for the sound of their voices or the creak of the barn door. But nothing. "Come on, pick up," I muttered to myself. The phone clicked in my ear, but it wasn't Dad's voice I heard. "Hello?" The voice was low and strained. It was Sam. "Sam, where are you? Are you okay? What's happening? What's going on with the storm?" I could hear him breathing on the other end, his voice shaky. I don't know. I saw them, too. I saw them, the things. The creatures in the storm. They were on the horses. The cows are gone, and I don't know where they went. I tried to get to the barn, but there was something watching me. I froze, feeling a cold sweat break out across my skin. "What do you mean, something watching you? What was it?" "I don't know. It wasn't like anything I've ever seen. It was just standing there, just outside the light. I thought it was just a shadow, but I don't think it was. It moved like it was waiting for something." I heard him take a shaky breath. I'm hiding in the shed. I don't know what's going on, but I can't go back to the house. I think it's too dangerous. Please, come get me." I didn't even think. I hung up the phone and rushed toward the door, but as my hand reached for the knob, I heard it. The unmistakable sound of hooves. Closer this time. My pulse quickened, and I turned around, looking toward the darkness outside. The storm had intensified, the rain now falling in sheets, but through it, I saw them again, shapes moving at the edge of the yard, just out of sight, but close enough to make my stomach twist. I could hear their hooves hitting the ground, an unnatural, rhythmic pounding that seemed to echo in my bones. The wind howled through the trees, and every gust of air felt heavier, as though the storm itself was trying to push me into the night. The figures in the storm were coming closer. I didn't have time to think. I grabbed my jacket from the hook by the door and rushed outside, barely feeling the rain as I sprinted toward the barn. I had to get to Sam. I had to make sure he was okay. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew that whatever those things were, they were out there and they were hunting us. The wind whipped against my face, and every step felt like it was pulling me deeper into the storm, into the unknown. I could still hear the hooves pounding in the distance, growing louder, and I could feel my heart hammering in my chest. I reached the edge of the field and slowed, listening carefully. The storm had drowned out most of the sound, but I could hear faint voices in the distance, Sam, calling my name, weak and distant. I called out to him, but my voice was lost in the roar of the wind. I had to get to him, had to make sure he was okay. But as I moved closer, I froze. The storm seemed to pause for a moment, the wind dying down just enough for me to hear it, the faintest sound of a whisper, carried on the wind. A voice, low and guttural, like a growl, but so soft that I thought I might have imagined it. Then came the sound of hooves again, but this time they weren't distant. They were right behind me. I turned, my heart leaping in my throat, and there, standing in the rain, I saw them. The figures. The riders. They were on horseback, but their horses were not horses. They were creatures, tall, unnaturally tall, their limbs too long and thin, their bodies twisted and covered in what looked like shadows. The riders were cloaked, their faces hidden, but I could feel their eyes on me. Their gaze was cold, predatory. One of them dismounted, its figure shifting unnaturally in the flickering blue lightning. It reached out with long, bony fingers, and I could hear its voice, a sound like wind through dry leaves. "You should not have come here," it said, and the ground beneath me seemed to tremble. And just like that, everything went still. I stood frozen in place, unable to move, unable to breathe. The cold air seemed to wrap itself around me, suffocating me with its heavy weight. The creature before me, its presence like an oppressive shadow, reached out with its elongated hand, the fingers thin and spindly, like branches that had been twisted by an unnatural force. It moved closer, and I could hear a faint crackling sound, as though something was breaking inside me. I wanted to run, to scream, but the terror kept my feet rooted to the ground. My heart pounded in my chest, the sound deafening in my ears. The figure loomed closer, the dark cloak billowing like smoke in the wind. The storm roared around us, but in that moment, everything seemed to grow quiet, as if the world itself held its breath. "You should not have come here," it repeated, its voice a low hiss, the words like ice scraping against my skin. "This place is ours. You are not welcome." I opened my mouth to speak, to ask what it wanted, what it was, but no words came out. My throat felt dry, as though the air itself was being stolen from my lungs. Instead, my mind raced, trying to make sense of the impossible. What was this thing? Why was it here? And what had happened to the cows? Why were they gone? I tried to look around, hoping for any sign of Sam, any indication of where he might be. But all I saw was darkness, the shapes of the trees looming like giants in the storm. The wind picked up again, howling through the branches, but the figures didn't seem to be affected by it. They stood still, unmoving, like statues in the middle of the tempest. One of them stepped forward, its presence commanding, and I could feel a pressure in the air, as though the very atmosphere around us had thickened, becoming suffocating. The shadowed rider tilted its head, and I could see something glowing faintly beneath the cloak, eyes, or perhaps just an illusion, glowing with an unnatural light. "Your time here is up," it said, its voice carrying a strange weight, as though it was speaking for something greater, something far older than the world itself. Before I could react, the figure reached out and touched the ground with its long, clawed fingers. The earth beneath me seemed to tremble, and I heard a distant, hollow noise, like the sound of something deep beneath the earth, something vast and ancient, waking up. A flash of blue lightning crackled across the sky again, bright enough to blind me for a moment, and when my vision cleared, the riders were gone. I stood there, motionless, heart still racing, trying to understand what had just happened. The storm continued to rage, but the tension in the air had shifted. The shadows had receded, but the dread remained, filling the space around me like a heavy fog. I couldn't stay out there any longer. I needed to find Sam. I needed to make sure he was safe. But as I turned to run back to the house, the ground beneath me shifted once more, and I stumbled. I didn't understand it, but I could feel it now. The earth wasn't the same. The path was different. I wasn't on the same ground I had walked on earlier. It was as if the land itself had shifted, reshaped by something far beyond my understanding. The air was thick with tension, and I felt as though I were being pulled in every direction. The world around me felt unstable, untrustworthy, like it was about to collapse in on itself. I had to get out of there, but with every step, the sense of wrongness deepened. I could still hear the distant whisper of the wind, but it no longer sounded like wind. It was something else, something darker. And then I heard it. A low growl. It was coming from behind me. I spun around, heart in my throat, and saw nothing but the dark, swirling storm. But the growl came again, louder this time, and closer. I could feel it vibrating through the ground, through my chest. Something was following me. My pulse quickened, and I broke into a run, desperate to escape. I could hear the growl now, growing in intensity, and it seemed to come from all around me. The hooves, too, were back, the steady, rhythmic pounding on the earth, a sound that felt too heavy, too unnatural. I ran faster, adrenaline coursing through my veins. The rain lashed against my face, stinging my skin, but I didn't care. All that mattered was escaping whatever it was that was behind me. I reached the barn, the door creaking as I slammed it open. I didn't hesitate to go inside, slamming it shut behind me. The barn was dark, and the familiar smell of hay and earth filled the air. But there was something wrong about it now. It felt different, empty in a way that didn't sit right. I fumbled for my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness, but what I saw made my blood run cold. There, in the corner of the barn, was a figure. Tall, dark, and thin. It was standing perfectly still, its body outlined by the flickering light. It was one of them. But how? How had it gotten here? I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The figure turned slowly, its face hidden in the darkness, and I felt the cold, overwhelming presence of something ancient and terrible closing in on me. The growl came again, low and guttural, but now I knew it was coming from all around me, from every corner of the barn. The shadows shifted, twisting in ways they shouldn't, and the air became thick with a suffocating sense of dread. And then, as quickly as it had come, the light flickered and died. The barn was plunged into darkness, and the world seemed to close in around me. I could hear their breathing, heavy and slow, and I knew then that there was no escaping. The riders had come for me, and I was trapped. The darkness enveloped me like a living thing. My hands trembled as I fumbled for the flashlight, but there was no light, only a hollow, suffocating blackness that seemed to press in from all sides. The air grew thick, almost tangible, as though I was swimming through it, each breath heavier than the last. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. The shadows were all around me, not just standing still, but shifting, twisting, closing in. Every corner of the barn felt alive with their presence. I could hear them now, their breathing deep and ragged, as though something was waiting to strike. I forced myself to take a step back, my feet stumbling on the uneven floor. My heart was pounding in my chest, my mind racing, but I couldn't make sense of anything. The growl came again, closer this time. It rumbled through my bones, vibrating in the air, making my skin crawl. What were they? What did they want? In the silence, I could hear the faintest scrape, like claws on wood. I turned my head sharply, my heart stopping in my chest. A shape was moving toward me, slow and deliberate. The sound of hooves against the floorboards reverberated in the barn, echoing in the quiet. I took another step back, my breath shallow, barely able to keep myself from hyperventilating. My hands were slick with sweat as I gripped the edges of the wooden beam. Beside me, trying to steady myself. The smell of earth and hay filled the air, but it was tainted now. There was something rotten, something unnatural about it. Then the shape stepped into the light. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long, spindly limbs that stretched out like branches. Its face was hidden in the shadows, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold, piercing eyes that seemed to see straight through me. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came. My throat was dry, constricted. The figure was too close now. I could hear its breath, raspy and slow, and the growl was growing louder, filling the barn with a sound so low it vibrated in my chest. I backed away, desperate to escape, but the barn seemed to stretch on endlessly. There was no exit, no way out. The shadows were everywhere, and I could feel them closing in on me, pushing me toward the center of the room. I had nowhere to run. The figure reached out, its long fingers brushing the floor with a soft, unsettling scrape. The hooves were louder now, closer, almost like they were right behind me. I spun around, my heart pounding, my head dizzy with fear. And then I saw them, more figures, emerging from the darkness. At least 3, maybe 4. Their faces were obscured by the shadows, but the sense of malice, of ancient power, was undeniable. They were not human. I could see their long, gnarled limbs, their eyes glowing faintly, like embers in the night. I backed away, my body trembling, my mind screaming for a way out, but the barn seemed to close in on me with every passing second. The air grew colder, more oppressive, until I could barely breathe. The growl echoed louder, closer now, vibrating through the very walls. "You shouldn't have come," one of them whispered, its voice low and guttural, like a voice from the earth itself. "You are ours now." I shook my head, desperation rising in my chest. "No. Please," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I don't know what you want, but I haven't done anything. Please." The creature's eyes flickered for a moment, and it tilted its head as though studying me. Its gaze felt like 1,000 needles pricking my skin, each second stretching into an eternity. "You don't understand," the creature said, its voice sharp, like metal scraping against stone. "This place is ours. The land, the storm, the cows, they were never meant for you." I felt a cold wave of dread wash over me. The storm. The cows. They had been taken, vanished without a trace. And now, it seemed, I was next. But there was something else, something buried deep inside my mind that I couldn't quite grasp. Something about the lightning, the strange, blue lightning that had lit up the sky that night. It hadn't been natural. It hadn't been like anything I'd ever seen before. It was connected to this. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my racing heart. I had to find a way out. I had to think. The creature's eyes narrowed. There is no escape. I didn't have time to think. I turned and ran, my feet slipping in the wet hay as I sprinted toward the back of the barn. The shadows followed me, their hooves clattering behind me, louder now, each step sending a shiver down my spine. I didn't know where I was going. All I knew was that I had to keep moving. The barn was endless. I felt like I was running in circles, the walls closing in, the darkness swallowing me whole. The growl behind me grew louder, more insistent, until I could feel it vibrating through my bones. And then, just as I thought I couldn't run any longer, the ground shifted beneath me. I fell. The barn floor seemed to give way, like the very earth had opened up beneath me. I screamed as I tumbled into the darkness, the world spinning out of control. And then, everything went black. I woke up to the sound of silence. A heavy, suffocating silence that pressed down on me from all sides. My body ached, and I could feel the coldness of the earth beneath me. The ground, hard and unyielding, seemed to press against my ribs as though the land itself was rejecting me. I tried to move, but my limbs felt stiff, as though I had been lying there for hours, maybe days. The darkness was still around me, but now it felt different. It wasn't the same oppressive shadow. It was colder, emptier. I blinked, trying to clear the fog from my mind. I had to focus. I had to get out. But as I sat up, I felt something. A shift in the air. A movement. Something was watching me. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. And there, standing at the edge of the pit, was the creature. It wasn't just one anymore. There were several, more than before. Their eyes gleamed in the darkness, and I could hear their breath, slow and measured, like the wind rustling through dead leaves. "You've been chosen," the lead figure said, its voice deep and resonant, like a low drumbeat. I opened my mouth to scream, but nothing came out. I was paralyzed, trapped in the grip of something ancient, something powerful. "You'll serve," the creature continued, its eyes boring into mine. "You'll be a part of the harvest." Before I could react, the ground beneath me began to tremble again. The air grew thick with an unnatural energy, and I knew then, with a certainty that chilled me to the core, that there was no escape. The harvest had begun, and I was its next victim. Red moon. It was a quiet evening, just like any other. The sun was sinking behind the horizon, and the fields surrounding our small farmhouse were bathed in the soft, fading light. I had just finished tending to the animals, and as I headed inside, I noticed the sky changing. The air felt a little different, heavier, as if something was approaching, something I couldn't quite place. I sat by the kitchen window, watching as the sky darkened. It wasn't an ordinary sunset. The colors, instead of the usual warm oranges and pinks, were bleeding into deep shades of red. Almost as though the earth itself was bleeding into the sky. I stared at it for a long while, feeling a strange pull toward it. Something about the redness wasn't right, but I couldn't look away. "Hey, look at that," my brother called from the doorway. "What's going on with the sky?" I turned to him, trying to shake the unease that had settled in my chest. "I don't know," I said, my voice quieter than usual. "It's like the moon starting to rise early or something." That was when I noticed it. The moon, still low on the horizon, had turned a deep shade of crimson. It was unnaturally large, too, as if it were closer than it should be. My heart began to race. I had read about lunar eclipses before, but never anything like this. "You should come inside," I said to my brother, my voice betraying the fear I was trying to suppress. "This doesn't feel right." But he didn't listen. He was already stepping outside, his eyes fixed on the growing red moon. "No, I want to see it better," he muttered, his voice distant. I watched him for a moment, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. The air had become thick and still, as if time itself had slowed down. The sounds of the farm, the soft rustling of the leaves, the distant calls of birds, had stopped. Everything was silent. I turned back to the window, the moon now fully risen, casting an eerie glow over everything. The red light seemed to seep into the very earth, and I could swear the shadows were growing longer, more distorted. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw something. It was faint at first, but unmistakable. A figure, moving across the sky, shifting in and out of sight, as if it were more than just a shadow. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I thought I might be imagining things. I blinked and looked again. It was still there. The figure seemed to grow in size, twisting and bending in unnatural ways, before it faded back into the red mist that clung to the edges of the moon. My pulse quickened. My brother was still outside, staring at the moon. I called to him again, but my voice felt distant, as if swallowed by the thick, oppressive air. That's when I heard it, a low, groaning sound, like something scraping against the earth. I jerked my head toward the source, my eyes widening in horror as I saw the shadows in the field shift. Something was moving toward the house, though there was nothing visible to explain it. My hand shook as I grabbed the door handle, pulling it open. "We need to get inside now," I shouted, my voice breaking. But when I looked outside, my brother was still staring at the moon, his eyes wide and unblinking. And that's when I saw it. Behind him, barely visible in the deepening dusk, something was rising from the ground. Long, pale shapes, like limbs, stretching upward. They weren't human, not by any means. I took a step forward, ready to run to him, but the world around me seemed to tilt. The sky, the ground, everything blurred. Then, a bright flash of light cut through the darkness, a strange blue lightning bolt, striking down from the red moon. The force of it sent a shockwave through the ground, knocking me to my knees. When I managed to get back to my feet and glance around, everything was different. The figures, whatever they were, had vanished. But my brother was no longer standing where I had seen him. The silence was deafening. I called out, my voice hoarse, but there was no answer. I ran toward the spot where I had last seen him, but there was nothing. Just the red glow of the moon flickering ominously in the night sky. That was the moment I knew, whatever had happened, it wasn't over. Something was coming. Something we were never meant to see. And whatever it wasn't finished with us yet. The next few days passed in a blur. I barely slept, barely ate. Every time I closed my eyes, the image of my brother standing there, eyes wide, unmoving, under the red moon, flashed before me. I didn't know where he had gone, or why he had stayed outside after I warned him. I didn't know why I hadn't run to him sooner, why I had just watched as he disappeared into the eerie glow. The morning after the incident, I went back outside to search for him, though deep down I knew it was pointless. The field was empty, save for the usual animals and the lingering chill in the air. But there were no traces of him, no footprints, no signs of struggle, nothing. It was as though he had simply vanished. I scoured the land for hours, calling his name until my throat was raw and my legs ached from walking endlessly across the fields. But there was nothing. Not a single clue as to where he had gone. By evening, I returned to the house, exhausted and defeated. I couldn't understand what had happened. Had he gone off on his own? Or had something taken him? But whatever it wasn't normal. None of this was. The sky that evening was still tinged red. The moon hung low, casting a sickly glow over everything, but there were no strange figures this time. Only the faint, flickering light of a strange energy that seemed to pulse in the air, like static. I decided to stay indoors after that. The days blurred into one another, each one more suffocating than the last. A thick fog had settled over the farm, both outside and in my mind. People in the village started noticing the changes too. It wasn't just me. At first, it was subtle. The livestock began acting strangely. Cows, usually docile and slow-moving, became agitated and skittish. Chickens that had always roamed freely in the yard suddenly refused to leave their coops. It wasn't just the animals, though. The people too started behaving oddly. Some of the older folk in town fell ill with strange symptoms, dizziness, headaches, fatigue. They couldn't explain it. The local doctor was baffled. He'd never seen anything like it. One evening, just as the last light of day disappeared, I saw the first signs of it in myself. A wave of nausea hit me out of nowhere, and I stumbled back inside, collapsing into a chair. The dizziness was so intense that it took me a moment to realize that the room was spinning. "Not again," I whispered, clutching the armrests, trying to steady myself. I'd been feeling unwell since the night of the moon, but this was different. The sickness wasn't just physical, it felt like it was creeping into my mind, pulling at the edges of my thoughts. I couldn't think straight, couldn't focus. I could hear whispers in my head, faint and unintelligible, like voices just beyond the threshold of my understanding. Then there was the dream. I don't know if it was a dream or if it was something more. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of scratching at the window. When I turned to look, there was nothing outside. But in the distance, I could see something moving, something that shimmered in the dark, like a mirage, but I couldn't make out what it was. It was too far away, too distorted. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just the sickness. But as I lay back down, a strange sensation crept over me. I felt like I was being watched. Not from outside the window, but from within. As though something was staring at me from the very walls of the house, the floorboards, the shadows. I pressed my palms to my eyes, trying to block out the hallucinations, but they didn't go away. The red moon was still there, casting its glow through the window, and it felt like the whole world had been painted with that unsettling light. That was when I realized something worse. I wasn't the only one feeling it. The illness was spreading. I could feel it in the air, in the way the people of the village moved with a slow, unnatural gait, in the way the animals no longer seemed like animals. The farm felt like it was being consumed by something dark, something ancient. The more I tried to understand what was happening, the more the whispers in my head grew louder. They were no longer faint. They had become clear voices, and though I couldn't make out the words, I could feel their intent. They were calling me. At night, I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the inevitable. I knew the moon would rise again, and I knew what it would bring. But I had no idea how much worse it would get. The following night, the moon was more oppressive than ever. Its red glow seemed to seep into everything, the walls, the furniture, the very air I breathed. I couldn't escape it. I felt as though it was pulling me in, dragging me towards something, though I had no idea what. I hadn't seen my parents for days. They were locked away in their rooms, barely moving. At first, they just complained of headaches and fatigue, but over time, it became something more. Their eyes were hollow, their skin pale. They no longer spoke. They only stared, as though waiting for something, as though they were listening to something only they could hear. I tried to shake the feeling, tried to push it all out of my mind. But I couldn't. There was something happening here, something wrong, and I was at the center of it. That night, I ventured out. I had to see it for myself. I had to understand. The whispers in my head had become more than just whispers. They were commands now, urging me forward, guiding me in the dark. I didn't want to follow them, but I couldn't help it. The pull was too strong. The night air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. The field stretched out in front of me, blanketed in shadow, but the red moon bathed everything in an eerie light. It was almost as if the land itself had been drenched in blood. I stumbled forward, my legs weak, but my mind was focused. I was drawn to the barn, the place where it all began, where the strange figures had first appeared in the sky. It had to be there, I thought. The answers I was looking for. As I neared the barn, I noticed the strange stillness of the world around me. The animals, usually so loud, were silent. The wind, usually so constant, had stopped completely. It was as if the entire world was holding its breath. When I reached the barn, I hesitated. There was something in the air, something thick and oppressive that made it hard to move forward. But the whispers called to me, growing louder, more insistent. I had no choice. I had to go in. I pushed open the door, and the smell hit me first. It was a sickening mix of rot and something else, something metallic. I gagged and stepped back for a moment, but the whispers urged me on. Inside, the barn was dark. The only light came from the red moon filtering through cracks in the roof. As my eyes adjusted, I saw movement in the shadows. Shapes, indistinct but large, shifting around the room. They seemed to be waiting for me. I took a step forward, and that's when I saw them, the figures from the sky. They weren't just in the air anymore. They were here, in the barn, in front of me. Their shapes were indistinct, flickering like mirages, but there was no mistaking them. They were real. One of them turned its head to look at me, and I froze. Its eyes were black, empty pits, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. I felt as though my very soul was being drawn into those eyes, as though they were pulling me in, taking me into their darkness. Then, without warning, the barn was filled with a deafening sound, like 1,000 voices crying out in unison. The air crackled with energy, and the ground beneath me seemed to tremble. I fell to my knees, clutching my head as the pain surged through me. It was as if the world was tearing itself apart. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was paralyzed, trapped in the barn with the figures that had come from the sky. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. The barn fell silent once more. But something was different. I looked around, my vision blurry, and I realized that the figures were no longer just watching me. They were coming closer, their forms becoming clearer, more solid. I could feel the cold presence of their eyes on me, could hear the whispers growing louder. They were speaking now, but their words were incomprehensible, their language alien. It wasn't meant for human ears. I closed my eyes, trying to block them out, trying to block the sensation of something crawling under my skin. The whispers were too much. The pull was too much. They were inside my head now. In that moment, I knew I was lost. There was no going back. Whatever had been unleashed that night was coming for me, and there was no escape. I couldn't tell how much time had passed. The barn seemed to stretch and warp around me, the walls bending in ways that made no sense. I opened my eyes, and the world had changed. The figures were all around me now, their faces, if they could be called faces, inches from mine. The pain in my head was unbearable, and I could feel my body weakening. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, slow and thudding. My breaths were ragged, and my vision was failing me. I tried to call out, to scream for help, but no sound came from my throat. The world around me was falling apart. And then I felt it. The last thing I felt before everything went dark. A cold hand, something that wasn't human, gripping my arm, pulling me toward the figures. And I knew then it was too late. There was nothing left. I had become one of them. I woke up in my bed, my body drenched in sweat. The room was suffocatingly hot, but my skin felt like ice. For a moment, I thought it had all been a nightmare, the barn, the figures, the red moon. But I could still hear the faint whispers in my mind, like a buzzing fly that wouldn't leave. I sat up quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. I rubbed my eyes, trying to clear away the remnants of sleep. Everything seemed normal. The moon had gone back to its usual pale glow, and the world outside was still. But something was wrong. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, a gnawing, crawling sensation that made my skin crawl. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and stood, shakily. I had to get out of the house and to see if anyone else had experienced what I had. Maybe I was going crazy, or maybe something was really happening. I walked into the hallway, and the silence hit me first. The house was eerily still. I called out, but no one responded. The whispers in my head were louder now, the voices echoing, impossible to ignore. I shook my head, trying to clear them away, but they only seemed to grow stronger. They were inside me, inside my thoughts. I reached my parents' room, and when I knocked, there was no response. Hesitant, I pushed open the door. The room was dark, the curtains drawn tight. It took me a moment to realize why I was standing frozen at the doorway. My parents were gone. There were no signs of struggle, no signs that they had left willingly. The bed was still made, the room was perfectly intact, but they were gone. It was as if they had never been there. I felt my pulse quicken. My breathing grew shallow. The whispers in my mind were becoming frantic now, desperate. Something was terribly wrong, and I couldn't stop it. I had to leave. I had to get away. I turned and ran outside, desperate for answers, but there was no one around. The entire farm seemed deserted. Not a single person was in sight. No animals. No movement. Just the deafening silence and the oppressive weight of the moon above me. As I walked through the fields, the ground seemed to shift beneath my feet. It wasn't the earth beneath me, but something else, something that moved and pulsated like it was alive. The whispers grew louder, more chaotic. They were coming from the ground, from the sky, from within me. I reached the barn again. This time, I didn't hesitate. The door swung open with ease, as if it had been waiting for me. Inside, everything had changed. The barn was now a twisted mockery of itself, the walls warped as though reality itself had bent under the weight of whatever had happened. The figures were there again, no longer in the shadows, but standing right in front of me. Their faces were clearer now, though still not human. They were made of shifting light, flickering like faulty television signals. They reached out, their hands, or whatever they were, brushing against my skin, leaving trails of cold fire. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My body was frozen in place, unable to move, unable to escape. The air around me was thick with the weight of their presence, and their whispers filled my head, louder and louder. And then, a voice broke through the chaos. My own voice, but not my own. It's too late. The words were clear, cold, and distant, as though they came from the deepest part of my mind. I wanted to fight back, wanted to scream, but I was no longer sure where I ended and the whispers began. Everything was tangled, everything was broken. The last thing I remembered before the darkness consumed me was the sight of the red moon, its light so bright, so blinding, that it felt like it was tearing me apart. And then, everything went black. I woke again, but this time, there was no bed, no familiar surroundings. I was lying on cold, hard ground. The air smelled of decay and rot, and I could feel it in my lungs, thick and choking. I tried to move, but my body was weak, as though the very life had been drained from me. I lifted my head, and that's when I saw them, the figures, standing in a circle around me. Their forms were more solid now, their faces clearer, though they were still not human. They weren't just watching me. They were waiting for something. I tried to speak, but my voice was barely a whisper. The whispers in my mind were louder now, and they weren't just voices. They were feelings, emotions, desires, all of them twisting together, pulling me deeper into their grip. I could feel them inside me, and I realized with a sickening certainty that I wasn't alone anymore. I was one of them. The moon above me glowed a blood red, brighter than ever before. It wasn't just a reflection of light. It was something else, something older and more terrifying than I could comprehend. The red moon had been watching, waiting for me to come. And now, there was no escape. I don't know how long I've been here. Time doesn't make sense anymore. The figures, those things, they are still with me, always standing in the corners of my mind, always watching, never speaking. The whispers have stopped, replaced by an overwhelming silence that drowns everything. It's suffocating. I try to move, but it's as if my body is not my own. I can feel the soil beneath me, cold and damp, but there's no sensation in my limbs. They move, yes, but only because I will them to. My muscles respond in jerky motions, as if disconnected from my mind, as if they are simply following some unspoken command. It's hard to explain, but I know, I feel it, that I'm not entirely myself anymore. The moon is always there, hanging in the sky, always red. It watches, and I watch it. There's a pull to it, a gravity that bends everything around it. I can't stop looking at it. It feels like it's inside me, inside my very thoughts, stretching and distorting them. I have become part of it, just as the figures are part of it. I feel them around me, closer now, their forms shifting, blending with the shadows, with the land itself. They are the land, the sky, the very air I breathe. I hear them, though not with my ears. They speak to me, not in words, but in feelings, in visions. Their messages are clear, but they are not comforting. They want me to stay here, to watch. But there is something else. A thought, a flicker of defiance deep inside me that refuses to let go, that refuses to accept what's happening to me. I try to focus on it, to hold on to it. It's hard, so hard. The moon's light is too strong, too overwhelming. I close my eyes, but even in the dark, I see it. The red moon. The light bleeds through my eyelids, burning into the back of my mind. The figures are waiting. They want me to join them, to become part of the endless night that they exist in. They want to share the void with me, to make me one of them. I can feel their touch, cold and infinite. Their presence presses against me, suffocating, overwhelming. I reach out, reaching for the defiance that is still there, buried deep within me. The moon flickers, distorts, something is changing. I look again, and for the first time, I see it clearly. The red moon is not just the moon. It is something else. It is a door, a portal, an entrance to a place beyond understanding. A place where the figures, no, the beings, come from. Where they go. Where they live. And as I stand there, frozen and helpless, the door opens. The moon splits in half, spilling its crimson light across the sky, across the land, across me. It burns through my skin, through my bones, through my very soul. The figures move now, advancing on me, reaching for me with their cold, insistent touch. The ground beneath me shakes, the air quivers with their presence. There is no escape. It's too late. The portal pulls at me, dragging me toward it. I try to fight, to resist, but the power is too much. The figures envelop me, their cold hands turning my flesh to ice, their eyes burning into mine, deeper and deeper until I can't see anything but the red moon. And then, everything goes still. The light fades. The whispers fade. The figures fade. I am alone. But not really. I am in the place they came from. The place beyond the red moon. The place where time and space do not exist. I am in the endless void, the place where there is no escape. And the moon is still watching. Always watching. A letter from a stranger. It was a quiet Wednesday morning when I found the letter in my mailbox. It wasn't unusual for me to receive mail, bills, advertisements, and the occasional letter from an old friend, but this one stood out. The envelope was plain, white, with no return address. The handwriting was neat, precise, but unfamiliar. A cold shiver ran down my spine as I held it in my hands. I had no idea who could be sending me something. I lived alone in a small apartment on the second floor of a building that barely saw any visitors. My days were routine, almost monotonous. Work, a quick dinner, a bit of television, and then bed. That was my life. I didn't have many friends, and even fewer people knew where I lived. I opened the letter slowly, the paper creasing as I unfolded it. Inside was a single page with a message written in the same neat handwriting. I know your routine. I see you every day. I've been watching. The words struck me like a punch in the stomach. I blinked, unsure if I had read them correctly. The letter continued. You wake up at 7 a.m., take a shower, and then make coffee. You always leave your apartment by 8:30 to catch the bus, and you return at precisely 6:45 p.m. You don't ever deviate. You always walk straight to your door, never pausing, always looking ahead. Always. You sit at your desk for hours, your computer screen glowing in the darkness. You make yourself dinner at exactly 7:30, and then you watch the news. I know all of this because I have been watching you for months. My hands were trembling now. I put the letter down on the kitchen table, feeling as though the walls were closing in around me. I looked around the apartment, trying to convince myself that it was just a prank. But the details in the letter, they were too accurate. Too specific. How could someone know all of this? How could they know my habits so intimately? I stood up, pacing the small space. My mind raced, spinning out of control. Who would do this? Why? The letter didn't explain anything. It was just a declaration. A statement of fact. But it left me with more questions than answers. I checked the locks on the door and windows, even though I knew they were already secured. The apartment felt smaller now, more oppressive. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone I couldn't see, was watching me. That whoever had written this letter was still out there, somewhere, observing my every move. My eyes darted around the room, searching for something, anything that could explain this. But there was nothing. Only the oppressive silence of my empty apartment. I returned to the table, picked up the letter again, and reread it, hoping I had missed something, anything that would give me a clue. But no, it was as chilling the second time as it was the first. You think you're safe, don't you? You think no one sees you. But I've been watching, and I'm getting closer. A chill ran through me, a coldness that settled deep in my bones. I couldn't breathe. The room felt too small. The walls seemed to close in even further, like they were pressing against me, trapping me. I forced myself to take a deep breath, trying to calm the rising panic in my chest. Rationally, I knew it had to be a sick joke. No one was watching me. No one could be. But the feeling of being observed, of having someone in the shadows, made my stomach twist with fear. I threw the letter into the trash, hoping to rid myself of the sense of dread it had instilled in me. But as I turned to walk away, I froze. A thought, like a whisper in the back of my mind, made my blood run cold. What if it wasn't a joke? What if someone really was watching me? The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling. I tried to carry on with my usual routine, waking up at 7, brewing my coffee, getting dressed in the same clothes I always wore to work, but everything felt off. The apartment, which once felt like my sanctuary, now seemed like a cage. Every creak of the floorboards, every sound outside the window, made my heart race. I kept checking the locks again, feeling silly for doing so. It was as though my mind was playing tricks on me, but the sense of being watched wouldn't go away. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just the strange letter messing with my head. Perhaps someone had been following me without me realizing, but why go to such lengths to make me paranoid? It didn't make sense. When I left for work that morning, I glanced over my shoulder, just in case. The street was quiet, just like any other day, but there was something unnerving about the stillness. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination running wild. Yet, I couldn't shake the nagging suspicion that someone was out there, hidden in plain sight. The bus ride felt longer than usual, each stop seeming to stretch out in time. I couldn't help but stare at the people around me, wondering if any of them knew what had happened. Could any of them be the ones behind the letter? The thought made my skin crawl. As I walked to the office building, I glanced up at the windows of nearby buildings. The reflections were blurred, but I couldn't stop looking, expecting to see someone staring back at me. I was paranoid. That much was clear. But then I noticed something strange. One of the windows on the 4th floor of the building across the street was slightly open. It was one of those office buildings where most of the lights were off, but this one window, it seemed to be just slightly ajar. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was deliberately left open, that someone was inside, watching me. I stopped dead in my tracks, staring at it for a moment. Then, I forced myself to look away. It was nothing. It had to be nothing. I couldn't let myself fall deeper into this madness. At work, I tried to focus on my tasks, but the thoughts kept coming back. Was it just a coincidence that I had seen that window? Could it be that someone was really watching me from there? And why had the letter come the day before? Why now? During lunch, I was in the break room when my phone buzzed. A text message. It was from an unknown number. I saw you looking at the window. I see you every day. Don't forget that. My stomach turned. My hands trembled as I stared at the screen. The number was untraceable, just like the letter. The same familiar feeling of dread washed over me. It was the same handwriting as the letter, just typed out instead. I immediately deleted the message, but my heart was pounding in my chest. I looked around the room at the familiar faces of my coworkers, none of whom seemed to notice my panic. I felt like I was losing my mind. How could they not see what was happening? Why wasn't anyone else reacting? The rest of the day passed in a haze, the weight of the message pressing down on me, suffocating any sense of normality. I couldn't focus on anything. Every time I caught myself looking at someone, I wondered if they were the one who had sent the letter or the message. Had they been watching me all this time? When I left the office later that evening, I was hyper-aware of every sound. The rustle of leaves in the wind, the hum of passing cars, all seemed to be amplified. The city was teeming with life, but I felt alone, isolated in my own bubble of fear. I couldn't go back to my apartment. Not like this. Not with the knowledge that someone was watching me. The thought of going back to the place where I had once felt safe now felt impossible. I ended up walking aimlessly, the city streets flickering past me. The more I walked, the more I realized how far I had strayed from my usual route. I didn't even know where I was anymore. But the feeling of being followed intensified, the weight of invisible eyes on my every step. I couldn't trust my own instincts. I ducked into a small alley to catch my breath. The silence was unbearable, but it was at that moment that I heard it. A faint shuffling sound, barely audible, but it was there. Someone was following me. I turned quickly, my heart hammering in my chest. There was no one behind me. Just the shadows of the alley stretching out in the fading light. It was nothing. I told myself it was nothing. I was just losing my grip on reality. But as I walked back into the street, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone I couldn't see, was right there, just out of view, always just behind me. I didn't sleep that night. The thought of closing my eyes, even for a second, filled me with an overwhelming sense of dread. My mind raced with possibilities. Who could be behind this? Why was I being watched? Every creak of the apartment, every slight shift in the shadows felt like a warning. The silence was no comfort, it was suffocating. I hadn't told anyone about the letter or the text message. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how crazy it all sounded. How could I explain to someone that I was receiving messages from an unknown person who seemed to know more about my life than I did? Who would believe me? I kept pacing in the small confines of my apartment, trying to find some way to rationalize what was happening. Maybe it was just a prank. Maybe someone was trying to get into my head, mess with me. But as I replayed the details over and over in my mind, the doubts began to creep in. There was something unsettlingly precise about the letter. The details it contained about my daily life weren't guesses, they were exact. My routine, my habits, the little things that made me, me. How could anyone know those things unless they had been watching me for a long time? As I looked out the window, my gaze drifted to the same office building from the previous day, the one with the window that had been left slightly ajar. I hadn't noticed it before, but now I saw that the window was closed. No longer a crack of openness, just an ordinary window. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing. Maybe someone had simply opened it earlier in the day and forgotten to close it. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. My mind kept pulling me back to the possibility that the person behind all of this was inside that building, watching me from behind that now closed window. The panic inside me tightened like a vice. I couldn't escape it. The next morning, as I walked through the usual route to work, I kept my eyes open for anything out of the ordinary. Every shadow seemed to stretch longer than usual, every face passing by seemed to be watching me. I glanced over my shoulder once, twice, 3 times, until I caught myself. What was I doing? I was falling into it again. I was letting the fear take over, but I couldn't help it. It felt like I was losing control of my own mind. I wasn't even sure what I was looking for anymore. Was it the stranger who had sent me the letter, lurking nearby, watching my every move? Or was it just my own paranoia? When I arrived at work, the usual office noise greeted me, the sound of typing keyboards, the low hum of chatter. But as I made my way to my desk, I saw something that froze me in place. My computer screen was on, even though I was sure I had shut it off when I left the night before. It flickered once, then the screen went black. I stood there, frozen, staring at the empty monitor. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't just some prank. This wasn't normal. Someone had been in my apartment, in my space. I swallowed hard, the panic rising in my chest, but I tried to shake it off. Maybe I had left it on by accident. Maybe it was all in my head. I couldn't afford to get caught up in this paranoia. I needed to focus on something else. But then my phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't just a text. It was a photo. A grainy image of my apartment, taken from what appeared to be the street outside. The angle was strange, like the person who had taken it had been hiding behind a car or a tree. The photo was blurry, but unmistakable. It was my front door. "I'm still watching you." I dropped the phone, my hands trembling. I could feel the blood draining from my face, the cold sweat building on my skin. It felt like the walls of the office were closing in on me, the space too small, too suffocating. The fear was overwhelming, paralyzing. I stumbled out of the office, barely able to focus on the world around me. I had to get out. I had to leave. The text, the photo, they weren't just coincidences anymore. Someone was in my life in ways I couldn't explain, and I didn't know how long I could keep pretending everything was fine. As I walked down the street, I glanced at the windows of the buildings again. The street felt like it was closing in on me, the noise and the people all blurring together. But as I turned a corner, I froze. There, standing just outside a cafe, was a figure, a man. He wasn't looking directly at me, but I recognized him instantly. He was wearing a dark jacket, his face partially obscured by a cap, but his posture was too familiar. It was him. The figure from the photo. The person who had been watching me. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. I froze, my body locked in place. My mind screamed at me to run, to get away, but my legs wouldn't move. He was here, in front of me, in plain sight, and I had no idea what to do. He looked up. Our eyes met. I don't know how long we stood there, just staring at each other. In that moment, the world felt like it had stopped spinning. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. I don't know how, but I knew that it was far from over. The shadow in the water. I had always been drawn to the water. There was something about its vastness, the way it mirrored the sky, calm yet endless, that fascinated me. The lake near my cabin was no exception. Quiet, isolated, and often shrouded in a thick mist during the early mornings, it felt like a place out of time where nothing could disturb its serenity. But that day everything changed. It started like any other summer morning. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting soft golden light across the water. I decided to take a swim before the heat of the day settled in, a habit I'd grown used to. I walked down the wooden dock, my feet brushing the cool planks, and dove into the lake. The The water was refreshingly cold, and I swam out to the deeper part of the lake, far enough where the shore was just a distant line. For a few moments, I lost myself in the rhythm of my strokes, the gentle sound of my breathing mixing with the soft lapping of the water. But then, something changed. I felt it before I saw it, a strange stillness in the air, a shift in the water's movement, as if something massive was moving beneath the surface, just out of reach. I stopped swimming, treading water as I tried to get my bearings. The calmness was unnatural. The only sound I could hear now was my own heartbeat. And then, beneath me, I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a play of light, the shadow of a cloud moving overhead. But as I stared, I realized it wasn't a cloud. It was something large, massive, looming beneath the water's surface. A shadow, dark and shifting, moved slowly beneath me. It wasn't the shape of a fish, or even the shadow of a tree trunk. It was too large, too deliberate. I froze. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Was it a trick of the light? The water? Some strange optical illusion? But no matter how I looked at it, the shadow didn't dissipate. It stayed there, just below the surface, as if watching me. Panic started to rise in my chest, but I forced myself to stay still. I had to understand what it was. Maybe it was a tree, a fallen log, or some strange creature swimming below. But as I peered harder, I noticed something more chilling. The shadow didn't move like anything natural. It was slow, deliberate, following me, no matter how I turned in the water. I quickly tried to swim back toward the shore, but the shadow seemed to keep pace with me. The water was getting colder, the surface rippling unnaturally, as though something beneath it was stirring, waiting. My heart raced as I desperately paddled toward the dock, but the shadow was still there, lurking below, just out of reach. My breath came in ragged gasps as I reached the dock. I scrambled up the ladder, my legs weak with fear. I didn't dare look back, but the feeling of being watched, pursued, clung to me like a second skin. I hurried back to the cabin, my skin tingling with the cold air, my thoughts whirling. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a fish, or perhaps my mind had played tricks on me. But deep down, I knew that was a lie. There was something in that water, something that didn't belong. And the worst part? It wasn't just the shadow that haunted me. It was the feeling that it was still out there, waiting. I locked the door behind me, my hands trembling as I tried to steady my breath. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see something, anything, moving outside. But nothing was there. The lake was as still and calm as ever. But I knew better now. There was something beneath that water. Something I couldn't see, couldn't understand. And it had seen me. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching. I tried to push it out of my mind, but it lingered, a constant presence. Something unnatural, something that would never let me forget. That night, sleep eluded me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shadow again, the massive, shifting silhouette beneath the water, following me. I tried to reason with myself. It was just my imagination. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I could feel its presence even when I wasn't near the lake, as though it had followed me home. The next morning, the lake seemed as calm as it had always been, the mist still lingering near the shore. I told myself I had overreacted, that the shadow was simply a figment of my anxiety, an illusion brought on by the isolation of the cabin. But deep down, I knew I had to return. I had to face it, whatever it was. I tried to push the fear aside as I walked back down to the dock. The water, glistening under the rising sun, looked peaceful, inviting even. The shadow from yesterday seemed like a distant memory, something that couldn't have been real. Maybe it was just my imagination running wild. But as soon as I stepped into the water, the air felt different. The cold seeped into my skin quicker than before, and the once calming ripples felt more oppressive, as though the water itself was alive, watching me. My heart began to race again. I swam out, just as I had the day before, but the moment I reached the deeper water, I felt it, something underneath me, moving. I stopped, my body tensing. The same stillness, the same unnerving calmness enveloped me. And then, I saw it again. The shadow, this time larger, more distinct. It was there, moving beneath the water, as though it had been waiting for me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. It was as if the water itself was pressing in on me, holding me in place, trapping me. The shadow shifted with purpose, slowly growing larger and closer. It was no longer just beneath me, it was around me, a massive presence, lurking just below the surface, invisible but palpable. I turned and began swimming frantically toward the shore, my body shaking, my mind racing. The shadow moved with me, mirroring my every movement, as if it had become part of the water itself. I could feel it closing in, the chill of the water wrapping around me like fingers. The deeper I swam, the faster it seemed to move, as if it were toying with me, pulling me further into its grasp. The shore seemed impossibly far. I couldn't escape. My legs burned, my breath was shallow, but still, the shadow followed. And then, just as I thought I might be consumed by the lake itself, I felt the water around me shift, the pressure easing. I looked down, panic flooding through me. The shadow had stopped. I pulled myself out of the water as quickly as I could, gasping for air. I scrambled up the ladder of the dock and onto the shore, my heart pounding in my chest. I glanced back, expecting the shadow to be there, to rise up from the water, but there was nothing. The lake was calm again, as if nothing had happened. I stood there, trembling. I knew it wasn't just my mind playing tricks on me. Whatever that shadow was, it was real. And it was waiting for me. I didn't feel safe anymore. I had to get away, but I couldn't shake the feeling that no matter where I went, it would follow. It wasn't the lake that scared me, it was the shadow. I was certain of one thing now, it wasn't just a part of the water. It was something alive. And it wanted me. I left the dock behind, rushing up the path toward the cabin, my feet stumbling over the uneven ground. Every breath was sharp, my lungs burning from the effort. But I couldn't slow down. I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadow was still out there, watching from the water, waiting for me to slip up again. Once inside, I locked the door behind me and collapsed against it, trying to steady my breath. My mind raced. I had to leave. I had to get away from this place before whatever was in the lake caught up with me. I kept glancing out the window, expecting to see something, anything, that might explain what had happened. But the forest was still, the sunlight barely filtering through the trees. It looked normal. Too normal. The normalcy felt wrong now. My mind refused to accept that I had just experienced something so unnatural. I grabbed my phone from the table, hoping to call someone, anyone. But there was no signal. No surprise there. The cabin was too far out. No one would be able to reach me. I felt even more isolated than before, cut off from the world and trapped with something I couldn't understand. I tried to reason with myself again, but the doubt lingered. Maybe I was just overreacting. It had been dark when I first saw the shadow, and I had been swimming in the depths of the lake. Maybe it had just been a trick of the light, a play of shadows from the trees. But no, something in me knew that wasn't true. As the hours passed, the air inside the cabin grew thick with unease. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the walls sent a jolt of panic through me. The shadow had felt like it was something alive, something purposeful, and I couldn't escape the sensation that it was still out there, waiting, watching. I paced the cabin, my thoughts spiraling. I had to go back. I had to know what it was. But part of me was terrified of what I might find. What if it wasn't just a shadow? What if it was something far worse? What if the water itself had a life of its own? My stomach churned at the thought, but the compulsion to return to the lake grew stronger. I couldn't let it haunt me. I couldn't let the unknown consume me. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. The sun was setting, the sky painted with hues of orange and pink, but there was an eerie stillness to the evening. It was too quiet. No birds chirped, no leaves rustled in the breeze. Just silence. I stood at the edge of the dock, my flashlight shaking in my hand as I pointed it out over the water. The surface gleamed, unnaturally still, like glass. Nothing moved. Nothing stirred. I took a deep breath and forced myself to step onto the dock, my footsteps slow and hesitant. My heart beat in my throat, each pulse like a drum of warning. The shadow had to be a trick of the mind. It had to be. There was no way something could be lurking beneath the water, waiting to drag me down. But as I reached the end of the dock, I felt the same pressure in the air. The same weight. I looked down, and there it was again, the shadow, larger this time, stretching across the water beneath me. I froze. My blood ran cold. It was real. And it was waiting for me. I tried to turn and run, but my feet wouldn't move. The shadow was closing in, encircling me, like a noose slowly tightening. I could see it now, clearly, distinctly. It wasn't just a shadow. It was something far worse. A dark mass, formless but menacing, creeping up from beneath the surface. Its edges twisted and churned like something alive, something hungry. I wasn't alone anymore. The lake itself seemed to have come alive, pulling me in. The shadow moved faster, wrapping around my ankles, my legs, dragging me closer to the water. No matter how hard I struggled, my body felt like it was sinking. The dock creaked under my weight, bending beneath the pressure. Panic surged through me as I clawed at the planks, trying to free myself, but the shadow was relentless, pulling me downward. And then I heard it, a low, guttural sound, like a whisper rising from the depths. It wasn't the wind. It was something more sinister. Something speaking to me. I stopped fighting. My breath caught in my throat, and for a split second, I thought I heard a voice, deep and ancient, echoing from below. It wasn't words, but a feeling. A cold, overwhelming sense of inevitability. This thing, whatever it was, had been waiting for me. For a long time. The shadow tightened its grip. It was no longer just beneath me. It was inside me, filling every space, every corner of my mind, my soul. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The darkness was all around me, pulling me in. And then, in an instant, the dock shattered beneath me. I plunged into the cold water, the shock of it cutting through the panic that had gripped me just moments before. I gasped, my lungs burning as I fought to stay afloat. But something wasn't right. The water wasn't just cold, it was suffocating. It pressed against me, pulling me deeper with each passing second, as if the very lake was alive, wrapping its limbs around me. My body screamed for air, but no matter how much I struggled, the surface seemed farther and farther away. I could feel the shadow still beneath me, the pressure growing heavier, as though it was pushing me into the depths. My heart raced, my chest heaving with the effort to stay calm, to make sense of what was happening. But my thoughts were clouded. I could only focus on one thing, the presence below me. The shadow was real, and it was coming for me. I kicked my legs, my arms flailing as I tried to find the strength to swim back to the surface. My hands met nothing but thick, dark water, and for a moment, I thought I was going to drown. I tried to scream, but the water filled my mouth, cold and suffocating. I felt my body begin to sink, the weight of the water pressing down on me like a force I couldn't escape. And then, silence. The rushing in my ears faded, replaced by an eerie calm. The struggle stopped. I was no longer fighting. It was as if time itself had frozen. The water held me in its grasp, not allowing me to rise, but not pulling me deeper either. I opened my eyes, though the water blurred my vision. But what I saw wasn't just darkness, it was something moving, shifting beneath me, something massive. The shadow had taken shape, no longer just an outline. It was a form, swirling with tendrils of darkness, stretching out in all directions. It was as if the lake itself had taken on life, a creature far older than anything I had ever known. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. And then, I heard it again, the whisper, the deep, guttural voice coming from below. This time, it was clearer. Louder. You shouldn't have come. The words weren't spoken, they were felt, an invasive, overwhelming presence inside my mind. My pulse thundered in my ears as the realization struck me. This wasn't just a shadow. It wasn't just a lake. It was something ancient, something that had been waiting for years, for centuries, for me to step into its grasp. It has always been here, the voice whispered again. It will always be here. I tried to pull away, but my limbs felt heavy, as though the water had become a part of me, slowing me down, locking me in place. It wasn't the lake holding me, it was something else, something that lived in the very depths of the water, in the darkness that filled the world beyond what the eyes could see. I could feel it now, a presence all around me, closing in. It was moving toward me, its tendrils curling around my legs, my torso. The cold was unbearable, not from the water, but from the very touch of it. The shadow was like ice, like a living frost creeping into my bones, freezing me from the inside out. You will stay here. Forever. The voice echoed once more, colder than before, as if it had always known my fate. I couldn't fight anymore. The lake's grip was too strong. It was too late. A sudden surge of panic washed over me. I wasn't going to survive this. The realization hit hard. There was no escape. The water, the shadow, had claimed me. And as I sank lower, I felt the weight of the darkness closing in until there was nothing left but the endless void of the lake. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the shadow, growing larger, swallowing the light. And in its depths, I saw eyes, countless eyes, staring at me from the dark. Eyes that had watched me come. Eyes that would never let me leave. When I woke, it was as if I had been pulled from some deep, suffocating sleep. My body felt heavier than ever, every muscle aching, and my head was foggy. I could barely see. My eyes opened slowly, and at first, I thought I was still underwater, the world around me a blur of dark shapes and shadows. But then I realized I was lying on the shore. The ground was wet, and my clothes clung to my skin. The air was thick with the smell of moss and decay. I gasped for air, my lungs burning as if they had been deprived of oxygen for far too long. I struggled to sit up, my body trembling with exhaustion. The lake stretched out before me, calm and still. It looked just as it had before. Peaceful. Innocent. But I knew better. I had seen the truth beneath the surface. I had felt the shadow's presence, the ancient thing that lived in the depths, waiting for the next fool to wander too close. I turned my head, looking around. There was no sign of the dock, no sign of the shadow. Only the stillness. But the whisper lingered, echoing in my mind, a reminder that I was never alone. "You shouldn't have come," it said again, but this time I didn't respond. I stood, my legs unsteady, and took a few steps away from the water. The lake had claimed me once, and it would do so again if I ever returned. I didn't know how long I had been lost in the dark depths, or what had happened to me, but I knew one thing for sure: I was no longer the same. The shadow had changed me, and I would never be free from it. I had learned the hard way: some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. Some things are better left undisturbed. Some shadows should never be chased. As I walked away, the whispers followed me, growing louder with each step. The van without a driver. I first noticed it about a week ago. It was a van, nothing particularly remarkable about it at first glance. A dusty old van, beige and worn with time, parked right in front of my house. It wasn't unusual for people to park on this street. It's quiet, mostly residential. I figured it was just someone stopping by, or perhaps a delivery vehicle, even though the street was far too calm for that. But there was something odd about it. Every morning when I left for work, the van would be there, parked at the exact same spot. And every evening, when I came back, it would still be there. I never saw anyone get out, never saw anyone approach it. Just the van, sitting motionless, as though it had always been part of the landscape. And I couldn't shake the feeling that it had been watching me, even though there was no one in sight. The first few days, I shrugged it off. People leave their cars parked for days, right? But then it became more frequent. I started to notice it wasn't just my house. Other neighbors mentioned it too. They'd spot the van at different times, always at the same spot, never moving, never being touched. I didn't think much about it, at least, not until last night. I was sitting on my porch, reading, when I heard the soft rattle of wheels on gravel. A sound that shouldn't have been there at that time of night. I looked up. There it was again, the van, slowly moving down the street. But there was something even stranger this time. There was no one inside. The driver's seat, usually occupied, was empty. I could clearly see through the dirty windows. The headlights cast an eerie glow, illuminating the street in front of it. The van coasted forward, slowly and silently, as if it were gliding. It stopped right at the end of the block, in front of the old house that had been vacant for years. I watched it for a long time, my heart pounding in my chest. How could a vehicle just move on its own? It wasn't possible. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself that maybe I hadn't seen it correctly, maybe someone had just been hiding in the dark. But deep down, I knew something was terribly wrong. I stood up, my mind racing. My eyes were fixed on the van, which was now parked once again at the far end of the street. No sign of life. No movement. Just the van, sitting in the shadows. My breath caught in my throat as I turned toward the door. Something told me that this was only the beginning, and I had a sickening feeling that I wasn't going to like what came next. The next morning, I woke up feeling unusually restless. I tried to dismiss the events of last night, but they clung to my thoughts like a thick fog. I couldn't focus on my work, couldn't shake the image of that empty driver's seat and the way the van had moved as if it had a mind of its own. I decided to go for a walk around the block, hoping the fresh air would clear my mind. The street was quiet, as it usually was. The sun was just starting to climb into the sky, casting long shadows over the sidewalks. When I turned the corner, my stomach dropped. There it was again. The van. Still parked in the same spot. But this time, there was something even stranger. The door was slightly ajar. It wasn't wide open, but it was enough to make my skin crawl. The van, which had been stationary for days, now seemed to be inviting someone or something inside. I couldn't help myself. I found my legs moving before my brain could stop me. I crossed the street and approached the van cautiously. The air around it felt heavier, as though the world had grown quieter, as though I was stepping into some otherworldly space. My fingers trembled as I reached the door. I looked inside. The seats were empty, but there was something on the floor of the van, something that hadn't been there the day before. A small, folded piece of paper. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. Why was it there? Who had left it? With a trembling hand, I opened the door fully, stepping inside the van. The air inside smelled musty, like something that hadn't been disturbed in years. I picked up the paper, unfolded it carefully, and read the words written in an unfamiliar hand. Leave now before it's too late. My heart skipped a beat. My pulse raced in my ears. The words seemed like a warning, a clear message meant only for me. I stood there for what felt like hours, holding the paper in my hand, the weight of its meaning crashing over me. What was I supposed to do with this? Who would leave a note like that? And why? As I stood frozen, a strange sound echoed through the empty street, the sound of an engine revving up, the unmistakable hum of the van's motor. I spun around, and my blood ran cold. The van's engine was running, but there was still no one inside. The vehicle, just like the night before, was moving on its own. Slowly, methodically, it began to roll down the street, heading in my direction. I couldn't move. My legs felt like lead. The van inched closer, the engine's hum growing louder and louder, until the deafening roar of it filled the air around me. Something inside me screamed. I had to get away. I turned to run, but before I could make it more than a few steps, the van sped up, cutting me off, blocking my path. And then everything went black. When I woke up, I was lying on the ground, the cold concrete beneath me biting at my skin. My head throbbed painfully, and I could barely open my eyes. I blinked, trying to make sense of what had happened. Where was I? I slowly sat up, my body aching as though I had been thrown across the street. My clothes were damp, my hands trembling. The street was empty. The van was gone. Had I imagined it? No. I had seen it. I had felt the chill of it. It wasn't a dream. I stood up shakily, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of everything. The van. The note. The warning. What did it mean? Why was it chasing me? I looked around again, hoping for any sign of life, any sign that this was just some twisted prank or coincidence. But there was nothing. Just the empty street, the abandoned houses, the morning light filtering through the trees. I turned toward my house, my heart pounding. But as I reached the door, I froze. There it was again. The van. It was parked right at the foot of my driveway. I stared at the van, unable to breathe, as a cold chill ran down my spine. The van was back, right where I had left it, parked at the end of my driveway as if it had always been there. But something was different this time. I couldn't explain it, but the atmosphere around it felt heavier. It was as if the van had grown more sinister since the last time I saw it. I stood motionless on the doorstep, the note still clenched tightly in my hand. The words from it echoed in my mind, "Leave now before it's too late." I didn't understand. Why would it be here again? Why did it keep coming back to me? I had never noticed this van before. It had never been a part of my life until now. My pulse quickened, my heart hammering in my chest as I slowly moved toward the van. There were no sounds, no birds, no rustling of leaves in the trees. The silence was suffocating. It felt unnatural, as though the whole world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. As I drew closer to the vehicle, I noticed something new, something that sent a wave of dread through me. The windows were fogged up. But it wasn't like they had fogged up naturally from the inside. The fog was streaked, smeared, as if something had touched the glass. Or someone. I hesitated, my hand trembling as I reached for the door handle. Something told me I shouldn't open it, that there was something waiting for me inside that I couldn't comprehend. But I had to know. I had to find out. I opened the door slowly, the squeak of the hinges sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. I peered inside, my breath catching in my throat. The interior was just as it had been before, empty seats, the faint smell of musty air, but now there was a noticeable shift. On the dashboard, there was a new item. A small object that hadn't been there before. A black key, lying innocently, just inches away from the steering wheel. I reached out without thinking, my fingers brushing against it. As soon as I touched the key, the van's engine roared to life. The sound was deafening, a violent growl of machinery that made my chest tighten in panic. I pulled my hand back instinctively, my heart pounding in my throat. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I had to get away from this van, from whatever it was that had chosen me. The thought of getting inside the vehicle, of starting it myself, felt impossible. It was as if it had already taken control of my fate. I stumbled back, my legs weak, and turned to run. But as I moved, I felt a cold breeze whip past me, and I heard the unmistakable sound of tires spinning on gravel. The van was moving. There was no one inside. No driver. No passengers. Just the van, gliding down the driveway toward me. I bolted toward my house, the panic setting in as the van picked up speed. It was as if it knew what I was going to do. It was following me. Chasing me. I reached the door and fumbled with the handle, my hands slick with sweat. The van was getting closer, the engine roaring louder with every passing second. I could hear the sound of its wheels on the gravel, feel the vibrations in my chest. I turned the doorknob and stepped inside just as the van reached the front steps. I slammed the door behind me, gasping for air. I pressed my back against it, heart racing, unable to move. I didn't know how, but the van had found its way back to me. It was hunting me. I could see it through the window, there, parked right outside my house, the engine still idling, as if waiting for me to make the next move. I stood there, frozen. What was it? What did it want from me? The questions kept circling in my mind, but I couldn't find an answer. That night, I couldn't sleep. The van was still outside, its lights casting an eerie glow through the curtains. I sat on the couch, wide awake, every sound amplified in the quiet house. The ticking of the clock on the wall, the occasional creak of the floorboards, and the low hum of the van's engine outside. I could feel the presence of something sinister just beyond the walls. Every time I glanced out the window, I saw it, the van, sitting still, unmoving, as if it had been there for hours, waiting for something. Waiting for me. I couldn't escape it. There was no running. No place to hide. The van had found me, and it wasn't going to leave until it had what it wanted. My mind raced. I thought of all the strange occurrences, the mysterious note, the way the van had moved on its own, as if guided by some unseen hand. I thought about the key inside the van, the way it had started up with just a touch. And most of all, I thought about how it had always been there, just out of sight, waiting for me to notice it. I knew then there was no rational explanation. This wasn't some prank. This wasn't a random occurrence. The van had a purpose, and I had somehow become its target. I could feel my chest tightening, my breaths coming faster. The walls of my house seemed to close in around me, suffocating me, as I realized that the van wasn't just a vehicle. It was a warning. It had come for me, and there was no way to stop it. I turned toward the door, my eyes fixed on the window. I had to get out. I had to leave. But as I reached for the door handle, I heard a sound that froze me in place. The van's engine had stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I could feel my heart thudding in my chest as I waited for something, anything, to happen. And then, the doorbell rang. I didn't move. I couldn't. My legs felt like they had turned to stone. The doorbell rang again, this time more urgently. I had no choice. I couldn't just stand there. I had to face it. I opened the door, and there, standing on my porch, was the van's driver. But there was no one there. Just the key. And it was for me. The key lay on the doorstep, gleaming in the dim light. I couldn't breathe. For a moment, I just stared at it, my mind refusing to accept what I was seeing. The van's engine had gone silent, and yet I could feel the presence of something watching me, waiting. I took a step back, my heart hammering in my chest. What had I just witnessed? There had been no figure, no driver, no passenger, just the eerie stillness of the van, now completely empty. But that key on the ground? It was an undeniable invitation, a silent command. I glanced over my shoulder, my eyes darting to the window. The van was still there, parked across the street, its headlights now dimming. It felt like it was watching me, but I couldn't tell if that was my fear playing tricks on me. There was no way I could take that key. No way I could open the door to that van, knowing what I'd already seen. But my hands, shaking uncontrollably, reached out for it anyway. The cold metal of the key felt wrong in my palm, like it wasn't meant for me. But something inside me urged me to move forward. I couldn't let this mystery go unanswered. I turned, still holding the key, and walked back to the van, my legs feeling heavy, as though each step brought me closer to some dark, inescapable truth. The headlights of the van flickered once, twice, then went completely dark, leaving only the glow of the street light above to illuminate its form. I stood in front of the van, the key still in my hand, staring at the empty seat through the window. I could almost hear a faint whisper, just a low, rasping sound, coming from inside, urging me to open the door. I didn't want to do it. I knew I shouldn't. But I couldn't help myself. My hand trembled as I reached for the door handle. The moment my fingers touched it, the van's engine roared back to life, louder than before, shaking the ground beneath me. It was as if the van had been waiting for me to make this choice. It knew I would. With a sickening thud, the door swung open, and I felt a wave of cold air wash over me. The faint smell of something metallic, something almost rotten, hit me like a slap. It wasn't the scent of a normal vehicle. It was something old, something decayed. I stepped back, holding the key tightly in my hand, but before I could turn away, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the driver's seat, there was no driver. But something was there. A figure. It was cloaked in shadow, its features obscured by the darkness inside the van. But there was something unsettling about it. Something familiar. The figure's head tilted slightly, as if it was looking at me, though I couldn't make out any details. It was like the darkness had taken form, stretching and shifting unnaturally inside the vehicle. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it wasn't human. I stumbled backward, nearly falling over my own feet as I turned to run. But as I did, the sound of tires skidding on gravel filled the air. The van was moving again, without a driver. It wasn't just idling. It was coming after me. I ran, my breath ragged in my chest, the streetlights flashing by in a blur. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening, but no matter how hard I tried, there was no explanation. No reason for what I was seeing. I glanced over my shoulder just as I reached the corner. The van was gaining on me, its headlights burning through the night like two eyes, relentless, unblinking. I ducked down an alleyway, hoping to lose it, hoping I could find safety somewhere, anywhere. But even as I rounded the corner, I could hear the van behind me, its engine roaring to life once more. It was like a predator, following its prey, knowing exactly where I would go. My mind screamed at me to run faster, to find some way to escape, but my legs were heavy, and my lungs burned with each breath. I could feel the van's presence closing in, its dark shadow hanging over me, pressing me forward. There was no escape. Suddenly, I heard a sound, a voice. Low, guttural, and faint, but unmistakably there. You shouldn't have taken the key. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart lurching in my chest. The voice, though distant, felt like it was right next to me, like it was coming from inside my own mind. It was as if the van itself had spoken, and it wasn't just a voice, but a presence, something beyond human comprehension. I turned, desperate to find the source, but the alley was empty. Only the sound of the van's engine filled the space, growing louder, almost drowning out my thoughts. I didn't dare look back as I continued running, but the words kept echoing in my mind. You shouldn't have taken the key. And as I neared the end of the alley, the ground beneath me seemed to shift. A terrible, low rumble vibrated the air, and I felt the earth tremble beneath my feet. The van's engine roared louder than ever, and just before I reached the end of the alley, I looked up to see the van. But it wasn't just parked. It was hovering. Inches off the ground, its wheels spinning in midair, suspended by some dark, unnatural force. The headlights shone with a terrifying intensity, casting long, twisted shadows down the alley as the figure in the driver's seat leaned forward, closer to the window. The figure's eyes met mine. And then, there was nothing. The last thing I heard was the screech of the van's tires, the sound of them tearing through the air as it sped toward me. Before everything went dark. This has been a long, dark journey through the night with Whisper Crowley. Thank you for staying with us until the end. Leave a like if these stories made you look at the darkness a little differently, and share in the comments what you enjoyed most or what gave you chills. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next Sinister Whispers. Until we meet again in the world of shadows.